Welcome to Chronos History Hub. Dear travelers, tonight, we travel to the edge of eternity, to a land born of sunlight and silence, where the river's pulse gave birth to a civilization of gods, of kings, and of dreams carved in stone. This is ancient Egypt, the eternal kingdom of the Nile. In the beginning, before the names of kings were carved in stone and before monuments rose toward the horizon, there was only the river. The Nile, vast and unhurried, wound through the silence of northeastern Africa, its waters gathering the memory of distant rains. Each year it rose and fell in a rhythm so ancient that it seemed part of the earth's own breath. Along its banks, life found balance, between the shifting desert and the narrow ribbon of green that would become Egypt. Long before the first dynasties, small communities began to follow the river's moods. They learned that the annual flood, though unpredictable, carried the rich black silt that turned sand into soil. In that dark earth, barley and emmer wheat took root, and with them permanence entered human life. Families who once wandered in search of food began to stay. They built small huts of reeds and mud, their walls reflecting the shimmer of the water nearby. From these humble beginnings, a civilization began to listen to the rhythm of nature, and in that listening it learned patience. The Nile was not merely a river. It was a teacher. It showed the early people of the valley how to measure time, how to divide the year by the rising of the flood and the retreat of the waters. Over generations, observation turned into understanding. They learned to predict when the fields would drown and when they would bloom. Slowly, they built canals and basins, shaping the land into a living clock. Agriculture was not just survival. It was the first quiet triumph of harmony between human will and the natural world. Each settlement, scattered along the valley from Nubia in the south to the delta in the north, lived by the same gentle principle. That life depended on balance. The villagers revered the river's generosity and feared its silence. When the floods came too high, homes were swept away. When they failed to come, hunger took their place. This delicate tension between gift and danger gave rise to something deeper, a sense that unseen powers governed the world. Out of gratitude and awe, the first gods were imagined. Happy, spirit of the inundation. Ra, the sun that drew the river to life, and Nut, the sky arching above the endless plain. Even before writing, before temples or tombs, faith had already found its home in the landscape. The land itself shaped the Egyptian mind. To the east and west stretched deserts that shimmered in heat, barriers that isolated the Nile Valley from the rest of the world. Within those golden boundaries, a sense of order grew. The river's path, predictable yet alive, gave structure to thought. Each sunrise over the eastern cliffs was a promise. Each sunset behind the western dunes a reminder of endings and rebirth. In time, these simple observations became the foundation of a worldview. Life and death, chaos and harmony, ever intertwined, ever flowing. Archaeologists have traced these earliest settlements at Merimd, Fayum, and Badari, places where people left behind pottery painted with spirals and birds, echoes of the river's movement. These artifacts speak softly of daily life. Women grinding grain, fishermen casting nets, potters shaping clay by hand. Their work was modest, yet within it lay the beginnings of continuity, the sense that human effort could endure beyond the moment. Each vessel, each carving, was both useful and devotional, an offering to the mystery that sustained them. With time, trade followed the flow of the river. From the south came gold, ivory, and the dark, aromatic wood of Nubia. From the north, the delta offered fish and papyrus reeds. The Nile became not only a source of nourishment but a corridor of connection. Villages exchanged goods, ideas, and symbols, the first faint stirrings of unity among the many tribes of the two lands. Even without a single ruler, a shared rhythm began to pulse through the valley, carried by the same current that had once carried silt. The people's bond with their river was more than practical. It was spiritual. To them, the Nile was not conquered or tamed. It was listened to. They saw themselves as caretakers of a balance that must never be broken. In this understanding lay the seed of what the Egyptians would later call Ma'at, the principle of cosmic order, truth, and balance. Though the word itself had not yet been spoken, its spirit was already alive in every harvest, in every act of gratitude toward the water. As centuries passed, these settlements grew more complex. Leaders emerged, not yet kings, but respected elders and organizers who managed irrigation and resolved disputes. Cooperation became essential. The river's generosity demanded coordination. In this way, governance was born not from conquest but from necessity, a quiet evolution shaped by the landscape itself. Through the stillness of millennia, Egypt's character was forming. Its people had learned that stability was sacred, that harmony could outlast hardship. The Nile taught them to look beyond a single lifetime, to think in cycles, not moments. And as they gazed upon the endless horizon, they began to sense that their world was not fleeting, but eternal. As the river carried its waters northward, it also carried memory of countless generations who had watched its surface gleam beneath the sun. The first villages became towns, their boundaries marked by the rhythm of cultivation. The sound of stone tools echoed softly across the plains. With each harvest, confidence grew, and so too did imagination. In their quiet persistence, the people of the Nile prepared to take their next great step, to unite the valley under one vision, one faith, and one enduring dream. And so, as the waters receded each year, they left behind more than fertile soil. They left the promise of civilization itself. As the reeds swayed in the evening wind, Egypt was awakening. Not with conquest or noise, but with the calm certainty of life learning to last. How did the scattered farmers of the Nile Valley begin to dream the same dream? The question drifts softly across time, like mist over the morning river. For thousands of years, small communities had lived in quiet independence along the Nile's long body, each tending its fields, each speaking its local tongue, each worshipping the spirits that watched over its portion of the flood. Yet gradually, something invisible began to weave them together. A rhythm of trade, belief, and shared survival that pulled the two lands, Upper and Lower Egypt, toward one another. In the south, where the river narrows between cliffs, the people of Upper Egypt became known for their red pottery and the strength of their hunters and herders. To the north, in the wide and fertile delta, communities grew amid marshes and reeds, cultivating fields that stretched to the sea. Though separated by hundreds of miles, they were united by the same steady breath of the Nile. Each flood left behind not only silt but connection. Goods exchanged, symbols adopted, ideas shared in silence along the current. Over generations, these small exchanges became threads in a larger tapestry. Archaeologists trace this gradual merging through pottery, ornaments, and carvings, the fingerprints of a society finding coherence. Distinct regional styles began to echo one another. Ivory combs and slate palettes bore similar animal forms: falcons, lions, and the intertwined necks of serpents, early emblems of unity. Even before writing, the Egyptian instinct for symbolism had begun to emerge. Across the land, artisans painted the same spirals, carved the same sacred animals, as if the entire valley were beginning to speak a single artistic language. This was the late pre-dynastic period, around 4000 to 3100 BCE, an age without kings but not without vision. Settlements like Nakata, Hierakonpolis, and Abydos rose in prominence, becoming centers of craft and ritual. Here, chiefs ruled not by tyranny but through reverence, their authority woven from the trust of their people. They organized labor, led ceremonies, and guarded the stability of the flood. In their graves, excavated millennia later, archaeologists found the earliest signs of hierarchy: jewelry of gold and lapis, ceremonial maces, and finely painted jars buried with care. These were no longer mere farmers. They were the first custodians of something greater, an idea of continuity that would one day crystallize into divine kingship. The Nile, ever patient, encouraged this unity. Trade flowed north and south like the current itself. Stone for tools, copper from Sinai, incense and ivory from Nubia. Each exchange strengthened the invisible bond between regions. As the river ferried goods, it also carried stories. of ancestors of gods of the order that governed the heavens. Over time, the people began to imagine that the two lands were reflections of one another, two halves of a single cosmic body. Upper Egypt, the narrow valley, became the symbol of strength and direction. Lower Egypt, the wide delta, the symbol of abundance and breadth. Together they formed a duality, both opposites and partners, needing each other to remain whole. Through this growing web of connection, leadership evolved. The early chieftains of Upper Egypt, particularly from the Naqada culture, began to dominate trade and warfare. Hierakonpolis emerged as a powerful center. Its murals depicting processions, boats, and scenes of victory over neighboring tribes. Among these, one motif stands out: a ruler wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt, striking down his enemies beneath a falcon god's gaze. It is not yet history, but the shadow of what history would soon become, the idea that a single leader could embody the strength of a people, could bring order from the endless cycles of chaos and flood. By the late 4th millennium BCE, this concept of sacred rulership had begun to take form. Authority was no longer only practical, it became spiritual. The ruler was seen as chosen by the gods, a bridge between the divine and the human. This belief, soft at first, would one day define Egypt for 3,000 years. The seeds of divine kingship were already planted, nourished by the same faith that guided the river's return. Among these early leaders stands a name whispered across stone and legend: Narmer, sometimes called Menes, the one who would unite the two lands. His story sits at the threshold between myth and memory, yet his presence is carved clearly on a single remarkable artifact: the Narmer palette. On its smooth green surface, we see the king wearing both the white crown of the south and the red crown of the north, striking his foes and marching in triumph. More than a record of conquest, this image is a poem of unification, the moment when Egypt's dual soul became one. Narmer's victory, whether won by battle or alliance, marked more than the rise of a man. It marked the birth of a nation, the first enduring state in human history, defined not by fleeting rule but by cosmic order. From this unity came the foundation of Memphis, the first capital, built where the river's two lands met. There, the palace and temple stood side by side, mirroring heaven and earth. The ruler's duty was no longer to dominate, but to maintain Ma'at, the balance that ensured the floods, the harvest, and the peace of the land. In these earliest days of kingship, the Egyptians conceived of time itself as cyclical, a constant renewal, like the Nile's rise and retreat. To govern was to sustain the rhythm of existence, to preserve harmony through ritual and care. Even war was seen as restoration, a return to order, not an act of ambition. This quiet philosophy would echo through every dynasty that followed, shaping Egypt into a civilization that prized stability above all. And so, from scattered villages and shared trade came something timeless. The farmers, potters, and chieftains of the valley had dreamed, unknowingly, the same dream, of permanence in a world of change. The Nile had taught them that unity was strength, and that strength, in turn, could nurture peace. What does it mean to rule not just people but the harmony of the world itself? In the quiet dawn of Egypt's first dynasty, this question shaped the heart of a civilization. Narmer, the unifier, the first to wear both crowns of the two lands, stood at the threshold between legend and history. His reign, around 3100 BCE, signified more than political triumph. It was the awakening of an idea that would define Egypt for millennia. That rulership was a sacred duty, a balance between heaven and earth. At the confluence of Upper and Lower Egypt, where the river divides and reclaims its many channels, Narmer founded a city destined to become eternal Memphis. To the ancients, it was Enebhej, the White Walls. Its location was no accident. Memphis sat precisely where the valley met the delta, a symbol in stone of the unification it embodied. The city became the heartbeat of the new nation, a meeting place of trade, worship, and governance, where the ruler could stand at the center of both land and cosmos. Here, the Pharaoh's palace rose beside temples dedicated to Ptah, the creator god and patron of craftsmen. In Memphis, divine thought and human labor joined in harmony. Every brick, every carving, carried a sense of purpose. The Egyptians believed that creation was not a single event but a continual act, and the pharaoh's role was to sustain that act through wisdom and ritual. Ruling Egypt meant preserving the rhythm of life itself. Narmer's successors, the kings of the first dynasty, deepened this vision. Names like Aha, Jur, and Den appear on the earliest king lists, carved with care onto ivory labels and stone vessels. Their tombs at Abydos, though modest compared to later wonders, reveal the beginnings of Egypt's architectural and spiritual vocabulary. Deep shafts lined with wood and brick were built to house the dead rulers, their chambers filled with offerings. Jars of wine, carved ivory, fine linen. Around them, smaller tombs held the remains of attendants, a solemn expression of devotion to the pharaoh's eternal life. The kings of this early age did not see death as an ending but as a passage into divine service. They ruled in life as the incarnation of Horus, the falcon god of the sky, and in death, they became one with Osiris, lord of the afterlife. Through this sacred duality, the pharaoh embodied continuity itself, the eternal link between creation and rebirth. The people's faith in their ruler was not imposed through fear, but through reverence. The pharaoh was not merely a monarch. He was the living balance of the world. Within this belief blossomed Egypt's guiding principle, Ma'at. More than a word, it was a worldview. The order that governs all things, from the stars to the silt beneath the Nile. Ma'at was truth, justice, and harmony. It was the calm in which existence found meaning. To uphold Ma'at was the pharaoh's highest calling. His laws, his rituals, his wars, all were judged by how well they preserved this balance. When floods came as expected, when trade flourished, when peace endured, it was said that Ma'at was strong. This spiritual order gave Egypt its rarest gift, stability. While neighboring regions fractured under shifting tribes and sudden famine, the Nile Valley moved to a slow, confident rhythm. Each dynasty built upon the last, not by overthrowing tradition, but by honoring it. Even innovation was an act of preservation, ensuring that the sacred balance never wavered. In this way, the Egyptians began to think in centuries, even millennia. Time itself was not a rushing current but a steady flow, circling endlessly, just as the river renewed its course each year. Archaeological traces from the First and Second Dynasties, fragments of pottery, ivory seals, and hieroglyphic inscriptions, speak to a people learning to record their world. Writing emerged not as poetry, but as order, lists of offerings, inventories of goods, decrees of kings. Yet, in those simple marks, humanity had taken a step toward immortality. To write was to preserve Ma'at, to keep memory from dissolving in the sands. The same hands that counted jars of grain would, in time, carve the names of gods into stone. The pharaohs of this era also began to expand Egypt's borders, sending expeditions south into Nubia and east toward the Sinai for copper and turquoise. These journeys were not acts of conquest alone but of connection, securing the lifeblood of trade that sustained the two lands. Each new venture reinforced the vision of the pharaoh as guardian of both abundance and order. The idea of empire was already forming, though it remained gentle, an extension of the Nile's reach, not a grasp for power. In their art and ritual, the Egyptians expressed gratitude through precision. Scenes of daily life, sowing, harvesting, building, became sacred images. Even the act of measurement carried holiness, for to measure was to maintain balance. Thus the tools of farmers and architects were as vital to Ma'at as the prayers of priests. The world, they believed, was a temple and the pharaoh its high priest. By the end of the Second Dynasty, Egypt had grown in confidence and complexity. The rulers of this era, though distant from the monumental fame of later kings, laid the invisible foundation of everything to come, the administration, the theology, the art of building in stone. Their reigns were the still waters beneath which eternity gathered strength. And as Memphis thrived, its temples gleaming beneath the sun, Egypt looked upward. The pharaohs had united the land and the spirit, and now they began to imagine permanence not only in rule but in matter. Stone, eternal and unmoving, would soon replace mud brick. The dream of eternity would take form upon the horizon. To touch the sky, they first learned to shape it from limestone. From the soft glow of dawn over the desert plateau rose a new dream, one not of conquest or rule, but of endurance. Around 2680 BCE, Egypt entered the Age of Stone. What began as brick tombs for kings evolved into colossal monuments of geometry and grace, born from a single, sacred ambition: to give form to eternity. The Old Kingdom, often called the Age of the Pyramids, began under the reign of Djoser, a visionary pharaoh of the Third Dynasty. His name would forever be entwined with his architect, Imhotep, a man remembered not only as a builder, but as a philosopher, healer, and priest. Together, they achieved something no civilization had yet dared. They transformed the human sense of mortality. At Saqqara, Imhotep designed a monument unlike any before. A great step pyramid, rising layer upon layer toward the heavens, as if the soul itself could climb toward the stars. Before this, Egyptian tombs, known as mastabas, were modest, rectangular chambers of mud brick. But Imhotep, guided by reverence and reason, conceived something grander. He saw the tomb not as a resting place, but as a bridge between the earth and the afterlife. Using limestone quarried from nearby cliffs, his builders shaped over 2 million blocks, each placed with quiet precision. The pyramid ascended in 6 giant tiers, its silhouette echoing the eternal stairway to the sun god, Ra. At its heart lay a labyrinth of corridors and chambers, sealed away beneath tons of stone. Within, offerings of food, vessels, and sacred objects were prepared for the pharaoh's journey beyond. Around it, a complex of courtyards, shrines, and symbolic buildings formed a miniature kingdom, a reflection of Egypt's cosmic order. Every wall, every column, carried meaning: life, death, renewal, the passage of the sun. It was not merely architecture. It was belief made visible. To walk the plateau of Saqqara even now is to sense the quiet pulse of that belief. The sand drifts across worn steps, the air hums with the weight of centuries, and in the silence, one can almost hear the echo of chisels, thousands of hands working as one, guided by faith and geometry. Egypt had learned to build not for kings alone, but for the concept of eternity itself. The success of Djoser's pyramid transformed Egypt's imagination. What had once been unthinkable now became the measure of divine kingship. Later rulers sought to emulate and surpass the vision. During the Fourth Dynasty, the art of pyramid building reached its zenith, beginning with Sneferu, a king of restless perfection. His reign produced not one, but 3 great pyramids, each an experiment in form and stability. At Mitam, the first of these, a stepped structure began to smooth its edges, symbolizing a transition between worlds, from the stairway of heaven to the seamless line of the horizon. But it was at Dahshur, with the bent pyramid, that Sneferu's engineers struggled between ambition and gravity. The angles changed mid-ascent, producing a gentle kink in the stone. Yet even this flaw carried beauty, a testament to the trial and patience of those who sought permanence in imperfection. Finally came the Red Pyramid, its slopes calm and true, its face glowing at sunset like the color of divine fire. It was here, perhaps, that Egypt first achieved the serene geometry that would define eternity. In Sneferu's works, we see not just the birth of monumental engineering, but the emergence of a national identity. To build a pyramid required thousands of laborers, not slaves as once imagined, but skilled workers, artisans, and farmers serving during the flood season when the fields lay beneath the Nile. They were fed, housed, and honored, bound by devotion and pride. Their labor was an act of faith. To build for the pharaoh was to build for the balance of the world. From their hands arose the perfection that would later define Giza. Sneferu's son, Khufu, would commission the Great Pyramid, a monument so vast it would defy comprehension for 4,000 years. But before Giza became legend, Saqqara and Dahshur had already given Egypt its language of eternity. Stone blocks aligned to the stars, foundations rooted in the rhythm of the river, walls inscribed with the pulse of divine order. The genius of Imhotep endured long after his lifetime. The Egyptians deified him centuries later as the god of wisdom and healing, a mortal who touched the eternal. His legacy lived not only in stone, but in the way Egypt thought of life itself, as an architecture of order, shaped carefully layer upon layer toward transcendence. The Old Kingdom's builders understood something profound, that eternity was not a distant promise, but a discipline. Each stone placed upon another was an act of harmony, a dialogue between human hands and the cosmos. Their temples and pyramids were not shouts into the void, but whispers meant to outlast time. As the sun sets behind Saqqara's horizon, the step pyramid still catches its fading light, its shadow long and patient across the sands. Beneath it, the silence is deep and full, the kind of silence that holds 1,000 lifetimes. Egypt had found its voice in stone, and through that voice, it began to speak across the ages. In these grand constructions, the human spirit learned permanence. Yet even permanence can crumble. Were the pyramids prayers, or monuments to the silence between stars? On the western bank of the Nile, where the desert begins its endless stretch, the Giza Plateau rises, a place where earth and sky meet in quiet geometry. Around 2550 BCE, under the reign of Pharaoh Khufu, this barren plain was transformed into one of humanity's most enduring wonders. Here, Egypt reached the height of its vision, a civilization translating faith into form and form into eternity. Khufu, known to the Greeks as Cheops, was the second king of the 4th dynasty and the son of Sneferu, the architect of Egypt's new age of stone. In his father's time, the pyramid had evolved from stepped monument to smooth-sided mountain. Now, Khufu sought perfection itself. He envisioned a structure that would mirror the very order of the heavens, a pyramid so precise, so vast, that it could embody the principles of Ma'at, the harmony that governed all things. The Great Pyramid rose stone by stone, over 2 million limestone blocks, each carefully shaped and set, their combined weight echoing the weight of eternity itself. At its completion, the monument stood nearly 147 meters tall, its sides aligned perfectly with the cardinal points of the compass. Even today, the margin of error remains less than that of modern survey instruments. Such precision was not accident but devotion, a devotion to order, to the eternal, to the belief that perfection could honor the gods. No written records describe how it was built. The methods remain part of Egypt's soft mystery, debated for millennia. Yet archaeology and study reveal not chaos, but coordination. An army of skilled workers, masons, architects, and planners, living in nearby settlements built to sustain their sacred labor. These people were not enslaved. They were participants in the great rhythm of Egypt's faith, serving their king as they would serve the sun. To build for Khufu was to ensure that light would continue to rise each day. The pyramid's internal structure, too, carried profound meaning. Beneath its monumental shell lay a quiet, deliberate complexity. The descending passage, the queen's chamber, the king's chamber lined with granite brought from Aswan hundreds of miles away. Air shafts pointed toward specific stars, Orion's belt and Sirius, linking the pharaoh's soul with the constellations that guided the Egyptian night. The entire structure was not merely a tomb, but a cosmic instrument, a map of rebirth, a dialogue between stone and sky. When the pyramid was new, its surface was covered with smooth white limestone casing stones, polished to brilliance. Under the desert sun, it would have shimmered like a beacon, reflecting light so intensely that it seemed to glow. To the ancient Egyptians, this was not a monument of death but of transformation. The pyramid represented the Benben, the primordial mound that first rose from the waters of creation. In this sacred form, Khufu would ascend to join the gods, not vanish into the afterlife, but become one with the eternal order of the cosmos. Around Khufu's pyramid, the plateau soon filled with echoes of devotion. His son, Khafre, built the second great pyramid nearby, slightly smaller, yet elevated on higher ground, giving it an illusion of equal majesty. Khafre's reign was marked by stability and splendor, and under his watch, the Giza complex expanded into a landscape of sacred geometry. The Sphinx, carved from a single mass of limestone, was likely commissioned during his rule. Its serene face, half human and half lion, gazes eternally eastward toward the rising sun, a guardian of the necropolis and a symbol of royal divinity. The Sphinx's features are worn now, its expression softened by wind and time. But even eroded, it still speaks with silence, a reminder of the pharaoh's enduring presence, calm and eternal. In its eyes, one might glimpse the same question that shaped Egypt's soul. How can something mortal reach beyond time? The final pyramid at Giza belonged to Menkaure, Khafu's son. Smaller, more refined, it balanced proportion with grace. Its base was clad in red granite, symbolizing vitality and resurrection. Menkaure's builders perfected what his ancestors had begun, harmony between earth, geometry, and spirit. Around his pyramid stood elegant subsidiary temples, where rituals were performed to ensure the pharaoh's safe journey into eternity. Even as the scale diminished, the artistry deepened. Egypt had learned that permanence did not require size, only precision and faith. Together, the three pyramids of Giza formed a celestial map, their placement mirroring the stars of Orion's belt, the constellation associated with Osiris, Lord of Resurrection. This alignment was no coincidence. For the Egyptians, the sky was not distant. It was a mirror of earth. The pharaoh's resting place was also his gateway to the stars. Each monument became a bridge between cosmic order and mortal life, linking the rhythm of the Nile to the eternal rhythm of the universe. To walk among the pyramids today is to move through silence made visible. The air is still, the horizon endless. The wind carries faint whispers, echoes of the mason's tools, the call of priests, the songs of those who hauled stone and sand under the golden light. Here time does not pass. It circles, patient and vast, just as the Egyptians believed it would. But beneath the surface of grandeur, quiet tremors began to stir. The wealth and labor required for such colossal works strained even Egypt's abundance. The pharaoh's divinity grew distant from the daily lives of the people. Temples flourished, bureaucracy thickened, and the balance of Ma'at began to tilt. The same faith that built eternity now risked becoming heavy under its own perfection. Yet even as change brewed unseen, the legacy of the pyramids endured, not merely as stone, but as an idea. They became Egypt's memory made visible, a civilization that believed eternity could be crafted by hand. Each block, each alignment, each shadow cast across the desert was a meditation on permanence, a quiet defiance against time itself. The Giza Plateau remains one of the calmest wonders of the ancient world. By day, it gleams beneath the sun's infinite light. By night, it rests beneath Orion's belt, the same stars that guided its builders. In this symmetry between heaven and earth lies the essence of Egypt's genius, the understanding that eternity is not reached through conquest, but through harmony. And so, as the kings of the Old Kingdom gazed upon their shining monuments, they saw not endings but beginnings. The pyramids were not graves, but horizons, where the mortal met the infinite, and the silence between stars found its echo in stone. As the kings grew divine, the balance of Ma'at began to tremble. When the floods faltered, so too did faith in the eternal. For centuries, Egypt's rhythm had been steady, the Nile rising and falling with divine precision, the pharaoh standing as its sacred guardian. But toward the end of the 6th dynasty, that rhythm began to break. The river's floods weakened, harvests failed, and the great machine of eternity, so carefully built, began to tremble. The Old Kingdom, once the golden age of stability, slipped into shadow. Under Pepi II, Egypt's longest reigning monarch, time itself seemed to stretch thin. His reign spanned over 90 years, a lifetime and beyond, but longevity brought not strength, only fatigue. The centralized power that had once flowed from Memphis began to erode. Provincial governors, known as nomarchs, gained autonomy. Their loyalty, once to the pharaoh's divine authority, shifted to their own survival and their own lands. Egypt fractured, not in violence at first, but in silence. The pyramids still stood, casting long shadows over the sand, but their meaning had begun to fade. The divine kingship, once radiant with Ma'at, appeared remote, unable to ease the hunger of its people or command the favor of the Nile. The annual inundation, the lifeblood of the two lands, became unpredictable. Some years, the river rose too little, leaving fields dry and cracked. Other years, too much, washing away what little could be sown. The delicate balance that had nourished Egypt's faith began to tilt toward despair. This was not merely a political decline, but a spiritual one. The Egyptians had believed their world was held together by divine order, by the pharaoh's harmony with the gods. When that harmony faltered, so too did the belief in permanence. Inscriptions from this time speak of chaos, not in war, but in the quiet unraveling of life's rhythm. Tombs went unbuilt, temples fell silent, and villages whispered of a world out of balance. Yet even in decline, Egypt's people endured. Across the land, local leaders rose to protect their communities. Nomarchs in Heracleopolis, Thebes, and Asiut took on the roles once reserved for kings. They managed canals, guarded harvests, and kept the ancient rites alive, each interpreting Ma'at in their own way. In the absence of a single ruler, Egypt became many Egypts, small kingdoms scattered along the river's length, each clinging to memory and ritual. Historians would later call this the First Intermediate Period, a time between greatness, spanning roughly 2 centuries of fragmentation and adaptation. Yet even as unity dissolved, the Egyptian spirit did not vanish. It retreated inward, into the art, the tombs, the quiet prayers carved into stone. From this period come haunting voices, texts like the Lamentations of a Pure and the Admonitions of a Sage, where scribes speak of a world turned upside down. The river is blood, and men thirst for water. Whether literal or symbolic, these laments reveal a nation reflecting on its fragility, its dependence on the unseen rhythm of nature. Amid the hardship, something subtle began to shift. Where once only kings claimed eternity, now ordinary people sought it too. The promise of the afterlife, once a privilege of the pharaoh and his priests, began to spread throughout society. Funerary texts, once confined to royal tombs, appeared in the burials of nobles and scribes. The belief in divine balance had democratized. The soul of Egypt was decentralizing, not only politically but spiritually. In the dark between dynasties, the Egyptians rediscovered resilience. The Nile still flowed, though weaker. Crops still grew, though less abundant. The temples still whispered prayers to the gods, though the king's voices had fallen silent. And through these gestures of continuity, Egypt waited, patient as the desert, steady as the stars. The old kingdom's monuments, though weathered, remained visible on the horizon. They stood as reminders not of failure, but of potential. To those who lived in this fractured age, the sight of the Great Pyramid or the gaze of the Sphinx may have been bittersweet, symbols of a lost golden order, yet also of what could return. For Egypt's genius was never in conquest or novelty, but in endurance. Even as the sunlight dimmed, the memory of Ma'at glowed softly beneath the dust. As centuries turned, the silence of disunity began to yield to renewal. In the southern city of Thebes, a new line of rulers was rising, pragmatic, devout, and guided by the lessons of decline. They would gather the threads of Egypt's spirit once more, restoring the flow of order and light. From the dust of decline, Egypt found its reflection once more. In the heart of the Nile Valley, as the echoes of the old kingdom faded into memory, the city of Thebes stirred. Its temples were modest then, its rulers local chieftains rather than kings. But within its stone courts and along the quiet flow of the river, a new vision was forming, one born from patience, memory, and the longing for balance. Around 2050 BCE, this vision took shape in the reign of Mentuhotep II, a ruler whose wisdom would lift Egypt from its scattered silence and reunite the two lands once again. The land he inherited was weary. For generations, Egypt had been divided between rival dynasties, the Heracleopolitan kings in the north and the Theban rulers in the south. Trade had faltered, temples crumbled, and the once sacred bond between heaven and the throne had grown uncertain. Yet amid this quiet fragmentation, the memory of Ma'at endured, not as an empire, but as an idea. The dream of unity still lingered in the hearts of priests, farmers, and scribes who remembered Egypt's former grace. It was this dream that Mentuhotep carried within him as he set out to heal his country. He began not with conquest alone, but with restoration. Thebes, his capital, became the symbol of rebirth, a city where both Upper and Lower Egypt could once more meet beneath a single god. Mentuhotep declared himself not merely king of Upper Egypt, but king of Upper and Lower Egypt, reviving the sacred titles of antiquity. Through diplomacy and devotion as much as through battle, he reforged the unity of the Nile. When his armies finally overcame Heracleopolis, it was not the sound of triumph that echoed, but of relief, the slow exhale of a nation returning to harmony. His reign marked the dawn of the Middle Kingdom, a new age of stability and introspection. Egypt, reborn, did not seek to replicate the colossal grandeur of the Old Kingdom's pyramids. Instead, it turned inward toward balance, moderation, and refinement. The architecture of this era spoke in softer tones. Temples were built into cliffs and valleys rather than raised upon open plains, their forms blending with the earth instead of defying it. At Deir el-Bahari, Mentuhotep's mortuary complex rose in terraces against the Theban cliffs, a marriage of rock and sky, of permanence and humility. Unlike the pyramids, this temple did not dominate the horizon. It embraced it. Columns echoed the rhythm of palm trunks. Courtyards opened toward the rising sun. Here, the pharaoh was not distant or godlike in isolation, but part of the eternal cycle he governed, living, dying, and joining the divine in measured grace. This shift reflected something profound in the Egyptian spirit. The chaos of the intermediate period had taught a quiet lesson, that Ma'at was not preserved by power alone, but by empathy, by the care of rulers for their people. Inscriptions from the Middle Kingdom speak in a new tone, kings describing themselves as shepherds, guardians, and listeners. Amenemhat I, who followed Mentuhotep, wrote of kingship as service. I made the beggar into the possessor of wealth. I gave bread to the hungry, water to the thirsty. The pharaoh, once an untouchable god, was now a steward of divine order. Egypt flourished again. Irrigation networks were repaired, canals deepened, and trade revived along the Red Sea and into Nubia. Expeditions sailed to Punt, returning with incense, gold, and exotic woods. Craftsmen and artists rediscovered precision and calm symmetry. The style of the Middle Kingdom was one of restraint, its beauty quiet rather than grand. Literature, too, blossomed. Works like the Tale of Sinew and the Instruction of Amenemhat reveal an Egypt reflecting on itself, a civilization that had looked into chaos and emerged wiser, more human. The Middle Kingdom was Egypt's introspective age, its age of maturity. Its rulers knew that eternity could not be built in stone alone. It had to be sustained in justice, balance, and the rhythm of daily life. Tomb inscriptions no longer glorified conquest, but virtue, fairness in judgment, kindness to neighbors, respect for the gods. I gave bread to the hungry, reads one from this era, and I hated iniquity. Even the afterlife, once reserved for kings, became a shared promise. In the coffin texts, the common man could now speak the words that once belonged only to pharaohs, ensuring his own passage into the field of reeds. Eternity had become democratic. In Thebes, the temples pulsed again with life. The god Ammonius, once a local deity, rose to prominence. A symbol of hidden power, the unseen wind that moves the world. Under the Middle Kingdom, Ammonius would merge with the ancient sun god Ra, becoming Ammonius Ra, the supreme force of light and renewal. Thebes thus became both the political and spiritual heart of Egypt, a city of reflection and prayer, where kings ruled not as conquerors, but as keepers of harmony. And yet, even in rebirth, there were murmurs of fragility. Beyond Egypt's borders, new powers were stirring. Desert tribes in the east, ambitious chiefs in Nubia, traders from the Levant. The Nile's flow remained faithful, but the world around it was changing. Egypt's peace, though radiant, was delicate. The kings of the Middle Kingdom had built balance from memory and will, but they ruled in a world that was beginning to shift. Still, for 2 centuries, the land of the two lands lived again in grace. Its temples rang with hymns, its fields shone with harvest. Its people dreamed beneath the constellations their ancestors had once mapped in stone. The pyramids of Giza watched from afar, ancient guardians, silent witnesses to a civilization that had fallen and risen anew. In the cool evenings along the Theban banks, one could imagine the reflection of those pyramids shimmering in the river, symbols of continuity, mirrored across time. Egypt, though changed, had not forgotten who it was. It had learned to rebuild not from pride, but from patience. As the sun set over Deir el-Bahari, the cliffs glowed gold, then crimson, then quiet. The Pharaoh's temple stood half in shadow, half in light, a perfect image of rebirth. Egypt had rediscovered its rhythm, the song of balance that had once shaped the world. But even balance is fragile, and the winds from beyond the deserts began to stir. When foreigners ruled the two lands, Egypt learned from its conquerors. The calm of the Middle Kingdom, so carefully restored, did not last forever. Around 1700 BCE, the slow pulse of Egypt's unity began once again to waver. Famine, shifting floods, and political intrigue weakened the throne. While in the Delta, quiet changes took root. Traders and settlers from the lands of Canaan and Syria-Palestine began to settle along Egypt's northeastern frontier. They brought with them their animals, their customs, and their gods. At first, they lived peacefully among the Egyptians, trading goods and ideas. But as central authority weakened, these foreign settlers, known later as the Hyksos, or rulers of foreign lands, rose from guests to governors, and from governors to kings. The Hyksos were not invaders in the traditional sense. There was no great army sweeping down the Nile. Instead, their rise was gradual, almost organic. Egypt had grown porous in its prosperity, its borders open to commerce, its rulers trusting in the permanence of Ma'at. But the balance had shifted. The fertile delta, rich in grain and trade, fell under the influence of these Semitic chieftains, who established their capital at Avaris. From this city, built on trade and defended by innovation, they ruled the north of Egypt for nearly a century. To the Egyptians of the south, their rule was both a humiliation and a mystery. Foreign kings now bore the titles of pharaoh, offering sacrifices to Egyptian gods and adorning themselves in the symbols of kingship. Yet their names, their language, and their faces told of distant lands. They worshipped Baal beside Ra, mixed Semitic and Egyptian traditions, and introduced technologies the Nile Valley had never seen before. Among these was the horse and chariot, a marvel of speed and power that transformed warfare. They brought the composite bow, stronger and more flexible than any Egyptian weapon, and new methods of bronze casting and fortification. To later chroniclers, the Hyksos were remembered as oppressors, usurpers who had defiled Egypt's divine order. But in truth, their rule was more complex. They maintained much of Egypt's administration, respected its religion, and kept its agricultural life intact. Their genius lay in adaptation. They adopted Egyptian customs while weaving their own innovations into the fabric of daily life. Trade routes reopened, linking Egypt to the Levant, Mesopotamia, and Anatolia. Through the Hyksos, Egypt once more became part of the wider world, exchanging goods, ideas, and technologies that would shape its destiny long after their departure. Yet in the south, in the old Theban heartland, resentment brewed like a slow fire. There, native Egyptian princes still ruled small territories, their power limited but their pride unbroken. They called themselves kings of Upper Egypt, though the Hyksos ruled the delta and the north. For them, the occupation was more than a political defeat. It was a spiritual wound. Ma'at had been disrupted. Foreigners sat upon the throne of Horus. The tension between north and south simmered for generations. It was during this uneasy era that Egypt's rulers began to rediscover ambition, not of expansion, but of restoration. The Theban line, descended from Seqenenretau and Kamos, began to prepare for what would become Egypt's first great war of liberation. Their resistance was not fueled by hatred, but by longing, the same quiet determination that had once rebuilt Egypt after the first intermediate period. The story of Seqenenretau is told in silence and scars. His mummy, discovered millennia later, bears deep wounds, crushed skull, broken jaw, signs of close combat. He likely died on the battlefield, leading his troops against the Hyksos. His son Kamose carried forward the struggle, sending messages carved on stelae that still stand today. In one, he declares, "I shall rid Egypt of the Asiatics. I will strike their hearts." His tone is proud but resolute, not vengeful, but certain that Egypt must return to itself. As Kamose pushed northward, Thebes swelled with purpose. Priests invoked the favor of Ammonius-Ra, artisans forged new weapons of bronze, and chariot builders studied the designs introduced by the Hyksos, adapting them with Egyptian precision. The war for liberation became not only a military struggle but a cultural one, a reawakening of the Egyptian spirit. When Kamose died before completing his campaign, the task passed to his brother's son, Ahmose, who would become one of Egypt's greatest unifiers. Under Ahmose's command, the Theban army adopted the very tools the Hyksos had brought: horses, chariots, and advanced weapons. What had once symbolized foreign domination now became instruments of Egyptian victory. One by one, the Hyksos strongholds fell. Avarice was taken after fierce fighting, and the remnants of their rule were driven eastward into the deserts of Sinai. For the first time in centuries, the two lands were one again. The expulsion of the Hyksos around 1550 BCE marked more than a political triumph. It was a spiritual renewal. Egypt had faced the unthinkable: foreign rule, internal division, and loss of divine order, and had emerged wiser. From the Hyksos, they had learned adaptability. From the struggle, resilience. The people had seen that even Ma'at, when broken, could be restored through will and unity. In the aftermath, Ahmose founded the 18th dynasty, ushering in a new era, the new kingdom, Egypt's age of empire. But the memory of the Hyksos lingered, not only as warning but as teacher. They had introduced the horse, the wheel, new weapons, and new trade routes, all of which Egypt now mastered. Out of invasion came innovation, out of occupation, renewal. The Egyptians, in their quiet wisdom, did not erase this chapter from memory. They recorded it in hymns and chronicles, not with bitterness, but with calm acknowledgement of its necessity. Every age of darkness, they seemed to understand, carried within it the seed of light. The Hyksos had ruled Egypt, and in doing so had unknowingly prepared it for greatness. When the last Hyksos kings vanished into history, avarice fell silent beneath the sands. The winds covered its walls, the reeds reclaimed its canals, and the Nile resumed its timeless rhythm. In Thebes, the priests of Ammonius sang hymns of victory and renewal, their voices rising with the dawn. Egypt was whole again. But the lesson of the Hyksos remained written in stone, that even the conqueror can become the teacher, and that wisdom, like the Nile, flows from many sources. Knowledge carried in the wake of invasion would forge a new kind of power. Reborn from struggle, Egypt's dawn burned brighter than ever before. When Ahmose ascended the throne, the Nile Valley still bore the marks of war. Scarred cities, scattered fields, temples abandoned to silence. Yet beneath the stillness was renewal. The long struggle against the Hyksos had reshaped Egypt's spirit. Its people had rediscovered unity not through peace, but through perseverance. And now, as Ahmose took the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, he became more than a king. He became a symbol of restoration, the living embodiment of Ma'at returned. From his capital at Thebes, Ahmose began rebuilding not just walls and temples, but trust in divine order. He restored the temples of Ammonius-Ra, repaired irrigation systems, and reopened trade routes that had once linked Egypt to the distant lands of Nubia and the Levant. His victories brought tribute: gold, ivory, and cattle. Yet his greatest triumph was stability. The land that had endured centuries of division now stood whole once more, united under one will and one god. The influence of Ammonius-Ra, once a local Theban deity, now expanded across the two lands. The god of the hidden and eternal merged with the sun god Ra, forming a symbol of kingship itself, the unseen power that sustained all visible light. In the temples of Karnak, priests chanted hymns to Ammonius Ra, calling him the king of gods, while Pharaoh, his chosen vessel, ruled as the divine made flesh. Under Amos' successors, Amenhotep I, Thutmose I, and the mighty rulers who followed, Egypt transformed from a kingdom into an empire. Victories in Nubia brought control of the gold-rich lands to the south. Expeditions to Syria and Palestine extended Egypt's reach into foreign territories. Yet this expansion was guided not by conquest alone, but by the quiet confidence of a people who believed the world itself was an extension of divine harmony. The art and architecture of the early New Kingdom reflected this new grandeur. Temples rose in stone and light, their walls carved with stories of victory and devotion. Reliefs depicted Pharaoh not as a warrior drenched in blood, but as a serene bringer of balance, one who smote chaos to preserve peace. The craftsmen of Deir el-Medina, working under royal commission, shaped visions of eternity from sandstone and pigment. Each stroke, each carving, whispered of gratitude. A civilization once broken now radiant with purpose. The New Kingdom was not merely a new chapter in Egypt's story. It was a rebirth of its very soul. From the struggle against the Hyksos had come strength, and from loss, wisdom. The people of the Nile had learned that even the most sacred order could be renewed through resilience. As the temples gleamed once more beneath the sun, and the banners of Ammonius fluttered in the desert wind, Egypt entered an age of golden light. Now came the empire's golden dawn, and its gods would walk among me. In the heart of Egypt, where the Nile curved in a long, quiet embrace, lay Thebes, city of gods, kings, and eternal dawns. It was not merely a capital, but a living symbol of divine order, a place where stone spoke the language of the heavens. Here, every sunrise gilded the limestone hills, and every sunset washed the temples in the color of eternity. In Thebes, spirit and stone intertwined, and the breath of gods was felt in the shifting light. After the triumph of Amos I, Thebes became the center of a renewed world. Its power radiated like sunlight, carried through the veins of the Nile. No longer just a provincial stronghold, it grew into Egypt's sacred heart, the meeting place between earth and sky. The great temple complex of Karnak, dedicated to Ammonius Ra, rose in steady magnificence over generations, each pharaoh adding to it as if continuing a single prayer. Obelisks reached upward like frozen rays of sunlight. Vast halls echoed with hymns to the unseen god. Every carving, every wall, was a verse in the unending hymn of divine kingship. Within Karnak's sanctuaries, priests tended the mysteries of Ammonius, the hidden one. He was both infinite and intimate, unseen yet everywhere. Through him, the pharaoh's rule found legitimacy, for Ammonius was the source of both breath and law. Processions of priests, draped in white linen, carried his sacred bark through the temple courts, followed by musicians whose harps and flutes filled the air with shimmering reverence. The city pulsed with ritual, morning offerings, midday hymns, and twilight chants that seemed to guide the sun itself into the underworld. To the south stood the Temple of Luxor, aligned perfectly with the axis of Karnak, linked by a long avenue lined with sphinxes, guardians of divine order. Once each year, during the Opet festival, the image of Ammonius Ra was carried along this path in a splendid procession, uniting the god with the pharaoh in a ritual renewal of cosmic harmony. The streets would glow with lamps and flowers. Dancers moved in rhythm to drums that echoed like heartbeats beneath the night sky. Through this sacred journey, Thebes became a mirror of the universe, its rituals keeping the cosmos itself in balance. Pharaohs who ruled from Thebes embraced both majesty and humility before the gods. Thutmose I expanded the empire's frontiers, but his greatest legacy lay in his devotion to Ammonius. He built great pylons and obelisks, declaring his victories as offerings to the divine. His daughter, Hatshepsut, would one day continue his work, transforming Thebes into a city of unparalleled grace and vision. But even in her time, the foundations of faith and architecture had already been laid. and Karnak stood as a promise of eternity carved in stone. Art and belief fused in the hands of Theban artisans. Painters adorned tomb walls with scenes of afterlife serenity, flowing water, green fields, and gentle gods welcoming souls into the West. These images were not meant to be dramatic, but reassuring, reminders that existence, like the Nile, was cyclical and eternal. Sculptors carved pharaohs and deities alike with calm faces and balanced posture, embodying the timeless ideal of Ma'at. The beauty of Thebes was not born from chaos or conquest, but from measured devotion, a civilization at peace with its gods and itself. Life beyond the temples reflected the same order. Farmers tilled the black soil, nourished by the Nile's floods. Merchants traded linen, incense, and gold. Scribes recorded each harvest and ritual with quiet precision. The rhythm of Thebes was one of certainty, a steady heartbeat echoing between the river and the desert cliffs. The people believed that as long as the rituals continued, the sun would rise, the floods would come, and the kingdom would endure. At dusk, when the heat softened and the air turned gold, one might imagine standing upon the terraces of Luxor, watching the light fade behind the Theban hills. In those hills, hidden in deep valleys, tombs were already being cut, chambers for kings who believed they would live again in the fields of eternity. Thebes was not only the city of life, but the threshold of forever. The harmony of Thebes lay in its balance between heaven and earth, between human effort and divine will. It was a city that reflected the Egyptian soul, steadfast, serene, and endlessly patient. Each block of stone placed upon another was an act of faith, a statement that beauty and order were the true paths to immortality. Through the temples of Thebes, Egypt whispered its most profound truth, that eternity was not a distant promise but a living presence, unfolding in the daily rhythm of the Nile and the measured breath of ritual. In the golden age of the New Kingdom, Thebes stood as a luminous center of civilization, not merely a city of kings, but a city of gods. And as its temples reached toward the sky, so too did Egypt's power and confidence. The pharaohs who followed would not only rule the two lands but command the known world, guided by the quiet assurance that their divine city was the heart of creation itself. As the incense rose and the stars began to gleam above the sacred pylons, one could almost feel the eternal rhythm resume, a gentle pulse beneath the surface of time. And from this sacred stillness, Egypt prepared to ascend toward the zenith of its glory. In the warm light of Thebes, where sandstone glowed like honey and the air carried the scent of lotus and incense, the Egyptian empire reached its first true height. The kings who followed Ahmose built upon his legacy, expanding their borders, perfecting their rituals, and inscribing their triumphs in the enduring silence of stone. Egypt had emerged from the shadow of foreign rule, and now the horizon itself seemed to bow before its will. The early New Kingdom pharaohs, Amenhotep I, Thutmose I, and Thutmose II, were not only rulers but architects of destiny. They reshaped Egypt's relationship with the world beyond its deserts. Thutmose I, bold and visionary, extended his campaigns deep into Nubia and north toward the lands of Syria. The empire now stretched farther than ever before, carried by chariots and sustained by gold from the southern mines. Each victory was both offering and affirmation, proof that the gods still favored Egypt, that Ma'at remained unbroken. The Nile's rhythm beat in harmony with conquest. Tribute flowed into Thebes. Gold, lapis, incense, exotic woods, and captives who labored in the temples and workshops of the empire. Egypt had become not just a land of grain and stone, but a crossroads of wealth and wonder. Its kings adorned the temples of Ammonius-Ra with colossal obelisks, each one piercing the sky like a frozen ray of sunlight, carved with hymns to the eternal. The world seemed steady, perfect, a divine order reflected in every stroke of the chisel. Then, amid this age of male warriors and builders, arose a ruler who would redefine the nature of power itself, Hatshepsut, daughter of Thutmose I, wife of Thutmose II, and stepmother to Thutmose III. Her reign began in the shadows of regency, yet it grew into one of the most extraordinary periods in Egyptian history. When her husband died young, The boy Thutmose III was too small to rule, and so Hatshepsut assumed the throne as regent. But over time, something within her shifted. The quiet caretaker of a child king began to rule in her own right. What followed was an act of both courage and innovation. Hatshepsut declared herself pharaoh, not queen consort or co-regent, but sovereign ruler of the two lands. She took on the full royal titulary, dressed in the ceremonial kilt, and even wore the false beard of kingship, a sacred symbol of continuity. Her portraits showed her body as strong and masculine, yet her inscriptions spoke with the calm authority of a woman who understood that power, like art, could take many forms. Her reign was marked not by war but by creation. Instead of expanding Egypt's empire through conquest, she expanded its prosperity through peace and trade. She sent great expeditions south to the fabled land of Punt, a place of incense, ebony, and gold. Reliefs on the walls of her temple at Deir el-Bahari still depict these journeys. Ships laden with treasures, fragrant myrtries, and the people of Punt greeting the Egyptians with gifts and open arms. These scenes, carved with exquisite detail, feel almost like dreams, reminders that power could also flow from harmony, not only from might. At home, Hatshepsut's vision reshaped Thebes into a city of divine elegance. Her temple at Deir el-Bahari, built beneath the cliffs of western Thebes, stands as one of the most serene achievements of Egyptian architecture. Its terraces rise like gentle waves, each layer reflecting light and shadow in perfect balance. Here, she was depicted offering to Ammonius-Ra, born of his divine will, not through lineage alone but through divine birthright. The temple's walls spoke of eternity, but its design whispered peace. In her rule, Hatshepsut became both priestess and pharaoh, blending masculine authority with feminine grace. She restored sanctuaries, reopened quarries, and sponsored artistic innovation that flourished under her careful watch. The workshops of Thebes produced sculptures and reliefs of breathtaking refinement, figures calm, symmetrical, imbued with quiet life. Her artisans perfected the visual language of timelessness, giving Egypt an aesthetic that would outlast empires. Her reign also revealed Egypt's deep capacity for adaptation. Though tradition was sacred, it was never static. In Hatshepsut's Egypt, order was maintained not by rigidity, but by renewal. Her authority demonstrated that Ma'at could manifest through wisdom and creativity as much as through conquest and control. Yet time, like the Nile, never stops flowing. When Thutmose III came of age, he assumed the throne beside her. For a while, their dual rule appeared stable, but upon Hatshepsut's passing, the young king reasserted traditional power. In later years, her images and inscriptions were chiseled from temple walls, her cartouches erased, not out of hatred, but from the Egyptian instinct to maintain divine balance. A woman ruling as king had been an anomaly in the eternal order, a gentle ripple upon still water. The scribes of later ages sought to smooth that surface again. But stone remembers what men try to forget. Though her name was struck away, her monuments endured. The temple at Deir el-Bahari remained a silent witness to her genius. The trade routes she reopened continued to enrich the kingdom, and her idea that wisdom and beauty could sustain power lingered in Egypt's collective soul. Under Thutmose III, Egypt's expansion resumed with dazzling force. The young king, once overshadowed, became the warrior pharaoh par excellence. His campaigns stretched as far as the Euphrates River, binding vassal states across the Levant in Egypt's sphere. Yet even his victories carried the echo of Hatshepsut's vision, for the empire he ruled was one she had strengthened through diplomacy, stability, and wealth. In the golden halls of Thebes, where incense curled in the air and priests sang hymns to Ammonius, her legacy persisted. Egypt, under her and after her, had learned that power need not roar to be eternal. Some rulers conquer through swords, others through stone and serenity. Hatshepsut had done both, by shaping a world that found peace not in submission, but in balance. And so, as the winds shifted over the desert cliffs, the temple she built remained a reflection of her soul, quiet, radiant, enduring. Her story became a reminder to all who followed that the truest form of power is harmony, and that the eternal can take on many faces. As the reign of Thutmose III rose to its height, Egypt stood unmatched. Its armies victorious, its temples gleaming, its faith renewed. But in the calm foundations beneath that glory lingered the gentle wisdom of a woman who had once ruled as king. And soon, that glory would reach toward the heavens themselves, in the reign of a pharaoh whose devotion to the sun would change Egypt forever. When the young Thutmose III finally stood alone upon the throne of Egypt, the world beyond the Nile waited, fertile, contested, and full of promise. The lessons of the Hyksos and the legacy of Hatshepsut had shaped him. From one, he inherited vigilance. From the other, patience. Now, with Ammonius Ra as his guide and Thebes as his heart, he turned his gaze north and south, toward lands that shimmered like distant reflections of Egypt's own abundance. The empire's expansion began quietly but grew into one of history's most measured campaigns. Thutmose's armies moved with precision, disciplined and efficient, their chariots sleek and swift, their bronze weapons gleaming in the desert light. Egypt's forces were no longer provincial militias. They were a professional army, the instrument of a god-king. Each campaign began with ritual, offerings to Ammonius, prayers at Karnak, and the raising of the royal standard. For the Egyptians, war itself was sacred duty, not conquest for greed, but the restoration of cosmic order beyond the Nile. The great test came at Megiddo in Canaan, a fortified city guarding the trade routes of the north. There, Thutmose faced a coalition of rebellious princes who had risen against Egyptian suzerainty. His generals urged caution, advising safer routes around the mountains. But Thutmose chose the narrow Aruna Pass, a bold decision that risked ambush yet promised surprise. The gamble worked. At dawn, Egyptian chariots thundered through the pass, their horses snorting in the cool mist, sunlight flashing from polished bronze. The enemy, caught off guard, faltered. Megiddo fell after a long siege, and with it, the gates of the Levant opened. From that victory flowed empire. One by one, the city-states of Syria and Palestine bowed to the pharaoh's will. Tribute came in abundance. Cedar from Lebanon, silver and copper from the north, lapis from Afghanistan, and exotic animals, leopards, monkeys, giraffes, brought to Egypt's menageries. Envoys from distant lands knelt before the throne of Ammonius' son, bearing gifts that filled the temples with wonder. The Nile Valley had become the heart of a world-spanning network, trade, tribute, and diplomacy flowing like tributaries into its sacred current. To the south, Egypt's reach deepened into Nubia, the land of gold and dark stone. Here, the pharaoh's architects raised temples carved directly into cliffs, sanctuaries to honor Ammonius in his southern form. Garrison towns secured the mines, and the wealth of Nubia poured northward, gilding the temples of Thebes. The border between Egypt and Nubia blurred, not through domination, but through exchange. The peoples of the south brought their art, music, and devotion, enriching Egyptian culture in ways that would endure for centuries. Every campaign was recorded not as a tale of violence, but as a hymn of order. The walls of Karnak bear Thutmose's triumphs in careful hieroglyphs. Lists of conquered towns, inventories of tribute, scenes of the pharaoh offering victory to Ammonius. Yet even in victory, the tone remains composed, calm, reverent, without boastfulness. Egypt did not see itself as an empire of oppression, but as a keeper of balance. Where chaos reigned, Pharaoh brought harmony. Where disorder threatened, he restored the rhythm of Ma'at. The empire's expansion brought not only wealth, but wisdom. Egyptian scribes stationed in foreign courts recorded languages and customs. Artisans adopted motifs from Syria and Crete. Merchants learned to navigate the currents of diplomacy. The world beyond Egypt was no longer alien. It was familiar, woven into the tapestry of Nile civilization. A cosmopolitan spirit began to stir, one that saw beauty not as property of the Nile alone, but as a shared inheritance of humankind. In Thebes, this new horizon was celebrated in stone and ritual. The temples of Ammonius grew vaster, their columns taller, their halls more intricate. Obelisks from granite quarries at Aswan rose skyward like prayers carved in light. As the empire expanded outward, Egypt's art turned inward, toward refinement, grace, and devotion. The more the pharaoh conquered, the more the priests praised Ammonius, whose invisible hand was said to guide every victory. But within this harmony, subtle tension began to form. The empire's success had made Egypt rich beyond measure, and with wealth came dependence on tribute, on foreign lands, on faith that justified power. The priests of Ammonius grew immensely influential, their temples functioning as both spiritual centers and treasuries of the realm. As Pharaoh offered more to the god, Ammonius' name began to eclipse all others. The divine and the political drew ever closer, bound in a golden knot of power. For now, however, the rhythm still held steady. Egypt under Thutmose III stood at its zenith, prosperous, confident, and radiant. The borders were secure. The temples gleamed. The people believed the blessings of the gods were endless. But every empire, no matter how serene its rise, carries within it the echo of change. And in the midst of this golden expanse, beneath the calm surface of devotion, faith itself began to transform, reaching for the sun in ways Egypt had never seen before. In the soft glow of the late 18th dynasty, Egypt reached a stillness so perfect it seemed eternal. The reign of Amenhotep III, the dazzling sun disk, marked the summit of Egypt's golden age, a time when peace, wealth, and devotion intertwined into a civilization radiant with confidence. The empire stretched from the fourth cataract of the Nile to the banks of the Euphrates, yet Egypt's power no longer depended on conquest. It was sustained by faith, faith in the pharaoh as divine, faith in the gods as eternal, and faith in the order that bound them together. Born into abundance, Amenhotep inherited an empire polished to brilliance by his forebears. His reign began not with the clang of battle but with the measured steps of ceremony. He ruled from Thebes, the holy heart of Ammonius, where every festival, every temple offering, affirmed his place among the divine. In the great courts of Karnak and Luxor, his image appeared not merely as king but as god, radiant, serene, untroubled by mortality. The line between man and divinity grew thin, until pharaoh and deity seemed to share a single breath. Under Amenhotep, Egypt turned inward not in isolation, but in refinement. The wealth of empire flowed into art, architecture, and ritual. He commissioned vast temple complexes, colossal statues, and sanctuaries bathed in sunlight. The most striking of these were the colossi of Memnon, two monumental statues that once guarded the entrance to his mortuary temple on the west bank of the Nile. Even in ruin, they tower above the plain, faces calm, hands resting on knees, gazing forever eastward toward the rising sun. To travelers then as now, they seemed less like monuments to a man and more like embodiments of eternity itself. Every aspect of Amenhotep's reign expressed divine equilibrium. His court at Thebes became a sanctuary of culture and ceremony. Diplomats from distant lands, Babylon, Mitanni, Hutti, arrived bearing gifts, seeking Egypt's favor through letters written in cuneiform on clay tablets, now known as the Amarna letters. These correspondences reveal a world where Egypt ruled not through the sword, but through prestige. Other kings called Amenhotep my brother, recognizing him not as a rival, but as the radiant center of civilization. The pharaoh's devotion to Ammonius Ra reached new intensity. In festival and offering, the god of Thebes became indistinguishable from the king himself. Ammonius was the hidden one, unseen yet all-encompassing. Amenhotep was his living light, his visible form. At Salab in Nubia, the pharaoh erected temples in which both he and Ammonius were worshipped side by side. In these sanctuaries, Amenhotep's image received prayers and offerings, a sign that the theology of kingship had crossed a threshold. The mortal had entered the divine. This merging of god and king was not hubris, but evolution. For centuries, Pharaoh had been seen as the son of Ra, the link between heaven and earth. But now the relationship deepened into unity. Hymns described Amenhotep not as servant of Ammonius, but as his reflection, the light through which the hidden god became manifest. The people worshipped with serene acceptance, seeing no contradiction. In the Nile's eternal rhythm, divinity and kingship had always been one. The era's art mirrored its theology, elegant, refined, suffused with peace. Sculptures of Amenhotep show a calm majesty, a softness of form that hints at inner stillness. The temples of Luxor glowed with reliefs of divine processions and festivals that blurred the line between heaven and earth. Architecture reached perfect harmony. Balance, proportion, light. The very stones seemed to breathe in time with the Nile. Yet beneath this tranquility, quiet change stirred. The immense power of Ammonius' priesthood, enriched by generations of royal favor, now rivaled that of the pharaoh himself. The temples owned vast lands, commanded armies of laborers, and stored wealth that rivaled the treasury of the crown. Ammonius' presence filled every corner of Thebes, his influence stretching from ritual into governance. The hidden god had become too powerful to remain unseen. Amenhotep, wise yet introspective, must have felt the tension. In his later years, he began to shift devotion toward a new manifestation of divinity. The Aten, the visible sun disk, pure and self-sustaining. Where Ammonius was hidden, Aten was open. Where Ammonius' mysteries dwelt in shadow, Aten's truth shone in light. To some, it was simply another aspect of the sun god. But to others, it hinted at something more, a singular vision of divinity, radiant and universal. From this brilliance would rise a single voice, his son's, daring to redefine eternity itself. For in the golden stillness of Amenhotep's reign, the seeds of revolution had already begun to glow. In a land where every hill, breeze, and current carried the presence of the divine, one man dared to dream of one god alone, a god of light, without form or shadow. His name was Akhenaten, born Amenhotep IV, son of Amenhotep III and Queen Tai. His reign would become one of the most extraordinary and unsettling chapters in all of Egyptian history. A quiet revolution not of conquest, but of belief. At first glance, his rise seemed unremarkable. He inherited an empire at peace, radiant in its prosperity. Yet behind the marble calm of his father's rule lay disquiet. The priests of Ammonius had grown immensely powerful, their temples swollen with wealth and their rituals binding the state in an invisible web of control. To Akhenaten, still a young prince with an inward gaze, this felt like a burden on Egypt's spirit, a cluttering of divine truth. He saw the world differently, not as a chorus of many gods, but as a single breath of creation that flowed through all things. He called that breath Aten, the visible sun disk. In its rays, he saw not the hidden power of Ammonius, but an open, universal force. The Aten had no body, no myth, no rivalry. It was pure light, life itself. The rays that descended from its orb ended not in weapons or scepters, but in hands gently offering the Ankh, the symbol of life. It was, perhaps, the most peaceful image of divinity ever conceived. When Akhenaten ascended the throne, he began to transform Egypt from within. At first, the changes seemed subtle. Hymns to Aten interwoven with older prayers, altars realigned to face the sun. But the transformation soon deepened, bold and irreversible. The temples of Ammonius were closed, their names erased from monuments, their images struck out with chisel and hammer. Akhenaten proclaimed himself not merely pharaoh, but the sole intermediary of Aten, through whom all blessings flowed. The new capital, Akhetaten, the horizon of the Aten, rose from the desert silence. Built in a broad bay of cliffs along the Nile's east bank, it was designed as a living hymn to the sun. Unlike the shadowed sanctuaries of earlier temples, Akhetaten was open to the sky. Its altars stood roofless, so that sunlight could pour directly upon them. The air shimmered with the heat of devotion. Life in this new city pulsed with strange beauty. Reliefs from Akhetaten depict scenes unlike any in Egyptian art before or after. The royal family, Akhenaten, his queen Nefertiti, and their daughters, are shown not as idealized gods, but as tender humans. They touch, they laugh, they hold their children beneath the sun's rays. Their bodies are elongated, faces delicate, bellies soft, a departure from the rigid symmetry of divine kingship. The art mirrored the theology: truth, not perfection; light, not mystery. The great hymn to the Aten, inscribed on the walls of courtiers' tombs, captures the spirit of this new faith. It praises the sun not for its might, but for its generosity. When thou settest in the western horizon, the earth is in darkness as if in death. When thou risest, thou makest all to live. In its verses, the Aten's light sustains all creatures, birds, beasts, strangers, and kings alike. It was a theology of unity, compassion, and balance. To the modern ear, it resonates with an almost philosophical calm, a meditation on nature's constancy. And yet, within Egypt, this serenity brought unease. The priests of Ammonius saw their temples silenced. The artisans of Thebes, their workshops closed. To worship one god meant to unmake the web of divine relationships that had held Egypt together for millennia. The festivals stopped, the familiar hymns vanished, and even the names of gods were forbidden to be spoken. For the people, faith was not an idea, it was rhythm, tradition, repetition. Akhenaten had taken that rhythm away. As the sun shone on Akhetaten, shadows deepened elsewhere. The empire's frontiers began to fray. Distant vassals complained of neglect. Letters from governors and allies pleaded for aid. Pleas that went unanswered. The pharaoh's gaze, once fixed on eternity, seemed unable to see the slow erosion of empire. Egypt's strength, once grounded in the divine order of Ma'at, now hung upon a single fragile ideal. Nefertiti, his queen, became the embodiment of this radiant vision. Together, they ruled as partners, their figures inseparable in art and prayer. She was the mirror of Aten's light, the earthly counterpart to Akhenaten's divine dream. In her, the artist captured a serenity both human and celestial, a reminder that even in upheaval, beauty persisted. But as years passed, even light can become too bright to bear. The Aten faith, for all its purity, left no room for memory or mystery. The old gods, Osiris, Isis, Ammonius, were not merely spirits to the Egyptians. They were symbols of cycle, death, and renewal. Without them, the afterlife itself seemed uncertain. The people obeyed their king, but in quiet hearts, they longed for the familiar balance of the past. When Akhenaten died, his dream faded swiftly. The city of Akhetaten was abandoned. The temples fell silent beneath the sand. The priests returned, restoring the names that had been erased. Even his successors sought to forget him. His son, the young Tutankhaten, changed his name to Tutankhamun, restoring honor to Ammonius and moving the capital back to Thebes. The Aten's horizon had closed, yet the memory of Akhenaten endures not as failure, but as wonder. In a civilization built upon continuity, he dared to imagine the eternal in a single form. His vision was too solitary to last, but it left behind a whisper, a hint that even in the oldest traditions, the human soul still seeks unity, light, and understanding. As the temples of Ammonius reopened and the chants of the old faith echoed once more across the Nile, Egypt exhaled, returning to the rhythm it had always known. The sun still rose, the river still flowed, and the gods resumed their watch. But somewhere in that endless light, the memory of Akhenaten remained. A moment when Egypt dreamed of one god, one sky, and one eternal dawn. And as the sun set on his vanished city, the desert reclaimed its silence, the same silence from which every new beginning would one day emerge. In the stillness that followed Akhenaten's radiant upheaval, Egypt stood uncertain, as if awakening from a dream. The temples that had once echoed with hymns lay silent, their gods exiled, their priests scattered. The people had lived a decade in the glare of a single sun, beautiful yet blinding. When that light dimmed, Egypt longed again for balance, for the quiet rhythm of Ma'at, the order of the world. It was then that a child ascended the throne. His name was Tutankhaten, living image of the Aten. Barely more than a boy, he would become the most famous of all Egypt's kings. Not for what he achieved, but for what he came to symbolize. Under the guidance of elders and priests, his name was changed to Tutankhamen, living image of Ammonius. The shift of a single word marked the restoration of an entire world. In those first years, the young pharaoh was not a ruler in the usual sense. He was a figure of healing, the gentle face of reconciliation between heaven and earth. Behind him stood powerful men, his advisor and future successor, and Hormheb, the general who watched over Egypt's armies. Together, they guided the child king through the delicate work of renewal. Temples once closed were reopened. Statues of Ammonius, Osiris, and Isis were raised again. The names that Akhenaten had erased were recarved into stone, as if time itself were being mended. The land seemed to sigh in relief. The chants of Thebes rose once more at dawn. Offerings returned to the altars, priests to their sacred duties. In every corner of Egypt, from Memphis to Nubia, the divine order reawakened. Tutankhamun's reign became a symbol of forgiveness, a gesture of continuity after rupture. To his people, he was the boy who brought back the gods. Within the palace, life regained its familiar rhythm. The art of this era, though brief, glowed with a new gentleness. Sculptures of Tutankhamun and his young queen, Ankhesenamun, show two figures leaning close, human, tender, at peace. In their faces, we see not the solemn divinity of old nor the alien grace of Akhenaten's vision, but something simpler, renewal through love, through belonging. Egypt had found its balance again. Yet even in restoration, fragility lingered. The empire's outer provinces, neglected during the years of religious turmoil, slipped from control. Hittite and Mitanni power grew in the north. Nubia stirred in the south. Egypt's wealth, though still vast, no longer flowed with the abundance of the past. The grandeur of Amenhotep III's time had softened into introspection. The priests regained their influence, and the court's intrigues thickened around the young pharaoh, whose life would be cut short before its promise was fulfilled. Tutankhamun's death came quietly, his reign barely spanning a decade. He was perhaps 18 or 19, still on the threshold of adulthood. His burial, though modest compared to the great kings before him, was carried out with reverence. In a small tomb hastily prepared in the Valley of the Kings, he was laid to rest surrounded by treasures meant to guide him into eternity. A chariot of gold, amulets of lapis and carnelian, and the mask that would one day become the most iconic image of ancient Egypt, serene, radiant, eternal. For more than 3,000 years, he slept in silence, his name nearly forgotten. But time, in its gentle patience, had other plans. When Howard Carter opened the tomb in 1922, the world rediscovered him, and through him rediscovered Egypt itself. The golden mask of Tutankhamun shone not merely as a relic, but as a symbol of rebirth, the same promise that had defined his reign. Tutankhamun's story is not one of conquest or reform, but of restoration. In his short life, the old gods returned, the temples reopened, and the rhythm of the Nile was made whole again. His reign marked the gentle end of a storm, a reminder that even after upheaval, harmony can be rebuilt, quietly and patiently. As the boy king's spirit sailed into the west, Egypt looked once more to the horizon. The age of radiant heresy had ended, and with it, a chapter of wonder and doubt. Ahead lay the twilight of empire, an era of power tempered by memory, of greatness tinged with weariness. And as faith found balance again, Egypt entered its final centuries of splendor, still radiant beneath the eternal sun, yet carrying in its heart the first shadows of decline. When the dawn light spills over the Nile's golden waters, few names echo through eternity as clearly as that of Ramses the Great, Ramses II, pharaoh of power, of monuments, of memory. His reign would stretch across nearly 7 decades, so long that generations were born and died beneath his rule. To his people, he was a living embodiment of Ma'at, the order that bound heaven and earth. To later ages, he became Egypt's eternal king, the pharaoh of stone, of splendor, and of stories. He came to the throne young, perhaps no more than 20, the son of Seti I, inheriting a nation renewed in confidence yet shadowed by past turmoil. The wounds of Akhenaten's revolution had long since closed, but the empire's borders still wavered. In the north, the Hittite Empire loomed, a formidable power whose reach rivaled Egypt's own. Between them lay Kadesh, a fortress city on the Orontes River, a gateway between two worlds. Ramses, restless and radiant, saw in Kadesh both danger and destiny. In the 5th year of his reign, he marched north with 4 divisions of soldiers, Ammonius, Ra, Ta, and Seth, their banners shimmering beneath the desert sun. The campaign, immortalized on temple walls, was not merely a battle. It was theater on a cosmic scale. The pharaoh, chariots, horses, the dust of movement, all became part of the grand rhythm through which Egypt reasserted its divine strength. But Kadesh was not the victory Ramses envisioned. Through clever deception, the Hittites lured his forces into a trap. The pharaoh's army was scattered. The division of Ammonius, marching ahead, found itself surrounded. What followed has become legend, a moment of near disaster turned into eternal triumph. On the field of chaos, Ramses fought alone. The inscriptions tell of his courage. His chariot thundering through the fray, the plumes of his crown whipping in the wind, his bow singing as he turned back the tide. The gods, it was said, rode with him, Ammonius himself lending strength to his arm. Whether history or him, the image endures, the lone pharaoh standing against the storm, not as mortal general, but as the personification of will itself. In truth, the battle ended in stalemate. Both sides claimed victory. Both retreated with their armies intact. Yet in Egypt's memory, Kadesh became triumph, the moment when Ramses's valor transformed uncertainty into legend. His scribes carved it upon the walls of Karnak, Luxor, and Abu Simbel, ensuring that even in defeat, the pharaoh's story would gleam as eternal light. And from that near disaster emerged something rare in the ancient world, peace. Years later, Ramses signed a treaty with the Hittite king Hattusili III, the first known peace treaty in recorded history. The document, preserved in both cuneiform and hieroglyphs, spoke of brotherhood, alliance, and shared destiny. It was a remarkable gesture, a recognition that even among kings who claimed divine blood, understanding could bridge the chasm of power. The two empires would coexist, their borders defined not by war but by words. In the years that followed, Ramses's reign blossomed into an age of monumental creation. The pharaoh, whose ambition reached beyond conquest, turned his gaze once more to stone and eternity. Across Egypt and Nubia, he built temples, statues, and cities that bore his name. Pyramus, his new capital in the Delta, became a city of vast courts, glittering pylons, and grand processions, the pulse of a rejuvenated empire. But it was in the southern sands that Ramses left his most lasting signature, the temples of Abu Simbel, carved directly into the cliffs above the Nile, for colossal figures of the king sit in eternal meditation, their faces calm beneath the rising sun. Twice each year, light travels through the temple's inner halls to illuminate the sanctuary, touching the statues of the gods and the pharaoh himself. It is as though the sun and stone conspired to remind the world that divine kingship, once imagined, could be made real. The art of Ramses's era glows with confidence and rhythm. His likeness, repeated countless times, stares serenely through centuries. Idealized yet human, vast yet gentle. Reliefs depict his family life, his queens and children, his festivals and triumphs. The world he ruled was one of ceremony and spectacle, where order flowed outward from the throne like sunlight upon water. Yet even in such radiance, time whispers softly. Egypt's power, though immense, was beginning to change. The outer provinces no longer sent tribute with the same obedience. The wealth that funded temples and armies grew thinner with each generation. Beneath the stone surface of stability, the sands of history shifted slowly but surely. Still, Ramses himself seemed untouchable, a being beyond decay. He lived to an age few could imagine, ruling for 66 years, outlasting enemies and successors alike. His descendants filled the courts, his lineage intertwined through generations. To the people who saw his statues, who heard the chants of his priests, he was not merely Pharaoh. He was Egypt itself. When at last he died, the land mourned as though a god had fallen silent. His body was placed in a great tomb in the Valley of the Kings, wrapped in gold and resin, the air thick with incense. But even death could not quiet his presence. The Greeks, centuries later, would call him Ozymandias, the ruler whose monuments mocked the impermanence of time. Yet to Egypt he was never ruin. He was the measure of kingship, the bright flame that illuminated a civilization's final age of grandeur. His temples still stand against the desert's breath, his name still read by the light of the rising sun. And as that sun climbs over Abu Simbel, striking the stone face that has watched it for more than 3,000 years, one can almost feel what Egypt must have felt in his time. A sense of calm majesty, of order unbroken, of eternity brought briefly, beautifully, into the shape of a man. As the last rays fade from the cliffs, another shadow begins to form, for no empire, however radiant, escapes the long patience of decline. The monuments endure, but power begins quietly to move elsewhere. As the light of Ramses the Great began to fade from the horizon, Egypt still gleamed with the illusion of immortality. The colossal statues stood unshaken, the temples filled with incense and praise, the Nile flowed as faithfully as ever. Yet beneath that surface calm, the empire's heart had begun to tire. The rhythm that had sustained Egypt for millennia, the harmony between faith, order, and abundance, was faltering. The generations that followed Ramses II inherited a kingdom of immense beauty but growing fragility. His many sons and grandsons, each bearing the name Ramses as though to preserve his greatness, ruled briefly and uncertainly. The burden of maintaining a vast empire pressed heavily on dwindling resources. The borders, once secure, began to fray. The Hittite alliance, though still honored, could not protect Egypt from the shifting tides of the ancient world. Beyond its frontiers, new forces gathered, peoples on the move, seeking fertile land and stability as famine and war reshaped the Near East. Within Egypt, the splendor of the temples masked an economic truth. The treasuries were running dry. The monuments that had once declared divine power now consumed it. Temples owned vast estates and employed countless workers, but their wealth flowed increasingly toward ritual and maintenance, not production. Gold from Nubia came in smaller quantities. Trade through the Levant grew uncertain. The pharaohs still claimed divinity, but their commands carried less weight beyond the walls of Thebes and Memphis. As the state weakened, another power quietly filled the void, the priesthood of Ammonius. In Thebes, the high priests rose to near-royal authority, controlling vast tracts of land, managing labor, and directing the wealth of the southern half of the country. Their rituals and offerings continued unabated, even as royal construction waned. In effect, Egypt was becoming two realms: a political kingdom ruled by the pharaoh from the north, and a spiritual dominion ruled by the priests from the south. This duality reflected not rebellion, but resignation. The divine kingship that had once unified the two lands was now dispersed among many hands. The priests claimed to act in the pharaoh's name, but their independence grew year by year. In the Temple of Karnak, inscriptions began to name not just the reigning king, but the high priest alongside him, a subtle sign that authority had become shared, even fragmented. Meanwhile, the land itself bore the weight of exhaustion. The Nile still flooded, but its rhythms were no longer enough to sustain the growing strain. Grain stores emptied faster than they filled. Taxes increased. Laborers deserted their posts. For the first time in recorded history, we hear of strikes. Workers at Deir el-Medina, the artisans who built the royal tombs, laying down their tools in protest over unpaid rations. Their grievances, written on scraps of papyrus, reveal an empire struggling to feed even those who served eternity. Foreign troubles compounded the strain. In the west, Libyan tribes crossed into the delta, first as settlers, then as soldiers, and finally as rulers in all but name. In the north, seaborne raiders, the mysterious sea peoples, swept across the eastern Mediterranean, toppling kingdoms and threatening Egypt's borders. Ramses III, one of the last great warrior pharaohs, managed to repel them in a series of fierce battles, immortalized on the walls of Medinet Habu. Yet even his victories could not restore Egypt's former strength. The reliefs at Medinet Habu show the pharaoh standing tall as chaos surrounds him. Ships burning, arrows flying, enemies tumbling into the sea. But behind the carved grandeur lies a deeper truth. Egypt had survived, but only barely. Its victories were defensive, its wealth depleted. The resources poured into war left the land drained. When Ramses III was assassinated in a palace conspiracy, the stability he had preserved unraveled almost immediately. In the generations that followed, royal authority collapsed into confusion. The throne passed rapidly between short-lived kings, some scarcely remembered, others mere names on broken monuments. The once centralized state became a patchwork of semi-independent powers, military commanders, local governors, and high priests each ruling their own domain. Even the sacred necropolises of Thebes, once inviolate, were plundered. Tomb robbers, desperate or opportunistic, stripped the resting places of kings, melting down gold and jewels that had once symbolized eternity. It was a bitter irony. The very civilization that had mastered the art of preserving the dead could no longer preserve itself. Yet Egypt did not fall with noise or flame. Its decline was quiet, like a great river that broadens and shallows before it disappears into the sea. The art and writing of this era reflect that fading energy. The careful precision of hieroglyphs gave way to hastier strokes. The grand architecture of earlier centuries was replaced by modest constructions, often reusing older stones. The spirit of permanence gave way to practicality. Still, the devotion to tradition endured. Even as resources dwindled, Egyptians continued to perform rituals, to inscribe prayers, to bury their dead with care. Their faith did not crumble. It adapted, holding to the rhythms of eternity even as the material world shifted beneath their feet. In the far south, the priests of Ammonius maintained Thebes as a spiritual capital, its rituals continuing in splendid isolation. In the north, at Tanis, new dynasties arose, Libyan in blood, Egyptian in ceremony, wearing crowns, performing rites, and claiming descent from the line of Ramses. Egypt no longer ruled the known world, but it continued to rule itself through memory and form. This slow transformation was not simply decline, but metamorphosis. The empire that had once reached for divine eternity now began to fold inward, returning to the simpler rhythms of land and river. Egypt became once again the land of the Nile, its people bound not by empire, but by endurance. And yet, through the long night of change, the temples still stood. The great pylons of Karnak still greeted the dawn. The statues of Ramses still caught the morning light. To travelers drifting along the river, Egypt must have seemed eternal still. Its gods serene, its stones unchanged. Only those who looked closer could see the wear in the edges, the cracks beneath the gold. By the end of the 20th dynasty, the pharaoh's power was little more than ceremonial. The high priest of Ammonius in Thebes ruled Upper Egypt as a spiritual monarch, while Libyan warlords controlled the delta. Egypt, once united by divine kingship, had quietly become a mosaic of kingdoms. But even this was not an ending. It was a pause, a long breath before transformation. The memory of empire, the discipline of ritual, the serenity of belief, these endured long after the crowns had passed to others. Egypt would rise again, in new forms and under new rulers, each borrowing the language of its eternal past. As the sun set on the age of the pharaohs, it did so slowly, tenderly, as though reluctant to leave. The light lingered on the faces of statues, on temple walls, on the river that had given life to all. And in that light, Egypt seemed to whisper to time itself, that even in fading, there is grace. Even in decline, there is continuity. And far beyond its borders, new powers gathered. The Nubians, the Assyrians, and the Persians, waiting at the edges of the horizon, where one empire's twilight would become another's dawn. As the light of the new kingdom dimmed, Egypt entered an age of quiet disarray, an era historians later named the Third Intermediate Period. To those who lived through it, it was not collapse but transformation. A time when the past still glowed in memory, even as the present shifted beneath it. The familiar order, Pharaoh, Temple, and Nile, endured in form, yet its foundations had grown soft. The ancient land was no longer ruled by one heart. Power had fractured, like light through a prism, scattering across cities and tribes. In the Delta, Libyan chiefs who had once served in Egypt's armies began to rise as kings in their own right. In the south, Thebes remained the sanctuary of Ammonius, ruled by high priests who claimed to act in the pharaoh's name but answered to none. Between them lay 1,000 miles of fertile land, bound by the river's eternal rhythm, one people yet many rulers. The Libyans were not strangers. For centuries, they had lived within Egypt's borders, some as soldiers, others as settlers, marrying into Egyptian families, adopting its gods and customs. Their chieftains, called great chiefs of the Ma, slowly became pharaohs, not through conquest, but through patience. The first of these, Shashank I, founder of the 22nd dynasty, reigned from Bubastis in the eastern delta. His rule brought brief stability to the north, his lineage woven from both Libyan and Egyptian blood. Under Shashank, Egypt sought to recover its influence abroad. He led a campaign into Palestine, capturing cities and reclaiming tribute, an echo of past glories. On the walls of Karnak, he recorded his victories beside those of Thutmose III, a deliberate gesture of continuity. The message was clear. The old world still lived, even under new hands. Yet within Egypt, division persisted. Thebes, loyal to Ammonius and its priestly lords, acknowledged Shashank's kingship in name but not in spirit. Egypt had become a land of two hearts, each beating to its own rhythm. Still, the Libyan dynasties brought with them a quiet resilience. Their rulers maintained the temples, repaired the canals, and upheld the rituals that defined Egyptian life. They built tombs adorned with hieroglyphs, prayed to Ammonius, Osiris, and Ra, and saw themselves as legitimate heirs of the two lands. But the memory of empire, of vast armies, foreign tribute, and golden age had become a story rather than a reality. Egypt's gaze had turned inward, to preservation rather than expansion. Time moved gently, as it always did along the Nile. Yet beyond Egypt's southern border, in the ancient land of Kush, a new power was gathering strength. The Nubians, long influenced by Egyptian culture, now looked northward not as subjects but as successors. Their capital, Napata, nestled beneath the sacred mountain Jebel Barkal, had become a center of both worship and ambition. Here, Egyptian gods were honored with Nubian devotion. Here, the memory of Egypt's greatness found new guardians. The kings of Kush saw themselves as restorers, heirs to a faith that Egypt itself seemed to have forgotten. Among them rose Pi, also called Pianki, a ruler of vision and conviction. To him, Egypt's divisions were not opportunity for conquest, but a sacred duty. Around 730 BCE, Pi marched north with his army, not as an invader, but as a pilgrim of restoration. His campaign, recorded in elegant inscriptions on a great granite stele, tells a story unlike any other in Egyptian history. Pi did not speak of conquest in terms of blood or vengeance, but of purification. He chastised Egypt's northern princes not for rebellion, but for neglecting the temples, for failing to honor the gods. He is not one who loves the gods, Pi wrote of a rival. He is one who fills temples with noise. In every city he entered, Pi made offerings, restored order, and left the local rulers in place, provided they bowed to him and to Ammonius. When he finally reached Memphis, the ancient capital, the northern rulers surrendered. Pi entered the city not as a destroyer, but as a priest-king. He stood in the great temple, purified himself, and made sacrifice to Ptah. Egypt, divided for generations, had once again been united, not by war, but by reverence. Pi returned to Nubia, leaving Egypt in the hands of loyal governors. But his successors would take the next step. Shabaka, his brother, established the 25th dynasty, known to history as the Kushite dynasty. Under these southern kings, Egypt experienced a renaissance. Temples repaired, art revived, faith renewed. The Nubians, dark-skinned and regal, embraced Egyptian tradition with sincerity and awe. They did not impose new gods or laws. They revived the old ones. To them, Egypt was not a conquest to be exploited, but a civilization to be restored. In Thebes, the priests of Ammonius welcomed them as chosen sons. The sacred processions resumed. The hymns echoed once more through the halls of Karnak. Sculptures of the Kushite kings show them wearing the double crown of Egypt and the ram's head symbol of Ammonius. Their faces calm, their features distinct yet dignified. They saw themselves as bridges between worlds. African and Egyptian, mortal and divine, past and future. Yet even this restoration could not last forever. To the northeast, a new empire was rising, the Assyrians, whose armies moved like iron storms. They looked upon Egypt not with reverence, but with hunger. The Kushite kings resisted with courage and faith, but they faced an enemy of unprecedented ferocity. Still, before the Assyrian tide reached the Nile, the Kushites left their mark. A brief, luminous chapter in the long night of Egypt's decline. They reminded the world that Egypt was more than territory or treasure. It was an idea, a harmony of spirit and form that could outlive kingdoms. And so, even as foreign hands held the crown, the heart of Egypt beat on, steady, enduring, unbroken. As the Nubian kings looked north across the river they had reclaimed, they must have seen the sun glinting on the temples of Thebes and felt that they had fulfilled something ancient, the return of balance after centuries of drift. Yet even as they gave Egypt back its past, the future was already moving toward them, swift, ironclad, and relentless. The sound of marching from the east would soon reach the Valley of the Kings, carrying the echo of a new empire's arrival. And in that sound, the Nile's ancient serenity would tremble once more. They came from the south, from the sun-warmed valleys of Nubia, where the Nile flows between cliffs of red stone and the temples of forgotten gods lie sleeping in the sand. To the Egyptians of the north, they were foreigners. To themselves, they were heirs. The Kushite kings of Napata saw Egypt not as a land to conquer, but as a sacred inheritance to restore. And in that vision, they rekindled a fading flame, one that had flickered through centuries of division and decay. When Shabaka, brother of Pi, took the throne, he did not begin his rule with conquest but with devotion. His first act was not to raise armies, but to rebuild temples. In Thebes, the priests of Ammonius welcomed him as a son of the god, for the Kushites had long revered Ammonius Ra as their own. They believed themselves chosen, guardians of the divine balance that Egypt had once embodied. Under Shabaka, Egypt's heart began to beat again with a quiet, ancient rhythm. The Kushite pharaohs ruled in a manner both familiar and renewed. They restored the rights of kingship, the coronation at Thebes, the festival of Opet, the sacred journeys along the Nile. They reopened sanctuaries abandoned since the late New Kingdom and called back the sculptors and scribes who had lived in obscurity. Temples once silent now echoed again with hymns to Ammonius, Osiris, and Ptah. Shabaka's inscriptions spoke of unity, of Upper and Lower Egypt joined under one divine rule. He referred to himself as the restorer of Ma'at, the eternal order of harmony and truth. To him, kingship was not a privilege, but a burden carried on behalf of the gods. His deeds reflected that faith: the repair of canals, the clearing of temples swallowed by desert, the re-establishment of the priesthood. Egypt had known conquerors before, but few rulers had ruled so gently, so reverently. Under his successor Taharka, the Nile Valley bloomed again. Taharka's reign marked the high tide of Kushite power, a time of prosperity, faith, and architectural wonder. From Napata to Thebes, temples rose anew, their columns carved with scenes of offering and renewal. The great temple of Ammonius at Kawa, and the additions to Karnak, stood as testament to his devotion. Even the Assyrians, whose empire stretched vast and menacing beyond the deserts of the Levant, regarded Taharqa with wary respect. Taharqa's Egypt was a place of peace and dignity. Trade flourished once more along the Nile. The fields yielded richly, and the people, long wearied by conflict, found comfort in ritual and continuity. Yet beneath this calm grandeur, change stirred beyond the horizon. In Mesopotamia, the Assyrian Empire was expanding, efficient, brutal, and unstoppable. Their armies marched with iron and fire, their kings claiming dominion over all lands touched by the sun. They looked westward now, toward Egypt, a land of gold and grain, a prize that symbolized not just wealth but legitimacy. To rule Egypt was to rule the known world. When the Assyrians invaded, Taharqa met them with courage. His army fought under banners of Ammonius, but faith alone could not match iron. The Assyrians advanced through the delta, capturing cities and breaking alliances. Taharqa retreated south, rallying his forces, but the tide of empire was relentless. Even in defeat, however, the Kushite kings preserved their dignity. When Tenudaman, Taharqa's successor, attempted to reclaim the north, his effort was valiant but short-lived. The Assyrians struck again, sacking Thebes, that eternal city of the gods. Its temples were plundered, its priests scattered. For the first time in centuries, the spiritual heart of Egypt fell silent. And yet, even in that silence, something endured. The Kushites retreated to their homeland in Nubia, but they did not vanish. They continued to rule at Napata and later Meroe, where the spirit of Egypt lived on. Its gods, its art, its hieroglyphs carried forward in stone and song. In a way, the legacy of Egypt found new breath in them. The Kushite revival had lasted barely a century, yet it shone with the quiet brilliance of a sunset, brief but unforgettable. It had reminded Egypt of itself, restored faith where there had been doubt, and shown that the essence of a civilization could be reborn even from beyond its borders. The sons of Nubia had come not as conquerors, but as keepers of memory. Their temples, carved in distant sands, would stand for another 1,000 years, monuments to a time when the south brought the north back to life. And as the Assyrians withdrew and new powers rose in their wake, Egypt once again drifted into twilight. But within that twilight glimmered the reflection of a truth the Kushites had preserved. That empires fade, but the sacred idea of balance, Ma'at, never dies. As the wind carried the last songs of Thebes across the river, the old gods listened still. And in the hush that followed, one might imagine Ammonius himself whispering through the reeds. All that was, shall be again, for I am hidden, but never gone. Beyond the horizon, the world was changing faster than the Nile could flow. Even the most eternal kingdoms must one day bow to time's new rulers. The winds that swept down from Mesopotamia carried more than dust. They brought the sound of iron. In the 7th century BCE, the Assyrian Empire stood as the most formidable power the ancient world had ever known. Disciplined armies, engineers of siege, masters of terror and tribute. Their kings ruled from Nineveh and Assur, where colossal walls and winged bulls guarded palaces carved with scenes of conquest. And now, their gaze turned toward the west, toward the land that had once been the heart of the world. Egypt. Egypt, under its Kushite pharaohs, still held fast to faith and tradition, but it was no longer a land of empire. The memory of Thutmose and Ramesses had faded into legend. The priests of Ammonius still performed the old rituals, but their voices echoed through nearly empty temples. The people farmed and prayed as they always had, but power had become fragmented, and Assyria saw its chance. The first blow came under Esarhaddon, the Assyrian king whose armies moved with chilling precision. They crossed the Sinai, conquered the Delta cities, and marched as far as Memphis, the ancient seat of Egypt's kings. Taharqa, noble and proud, resisted with valor but could not withstand the new age of iron. Memphis fell, its walls shattered by rams and flame. Yet even then, Taharqa did not yield completely. He retreated southward to Thebes, and from there to Nubia, carrying with him the sacred flame of Egypt's continuity. The Assyrians installed their own governors, but they ruled a land they did not understand. To them, Egypt was a trophy, a source of tribute, not of spirit. Rebellion soon followed. When Tenutaman, Taharqa's successor, sought to reclaim the throne, he rallied the faithful of Thebes and marched north once more. For a moment, the Nile seemed to remember its old defiance. The cities rose again in loyalty to their southern king. But the triumph was fleeting. In 663 BCE, Ashurbanipal, the last great Assyrian monarch, descended upon Egypt with an army that moved like a storm. They struck Thebes with merciless force. The city of gods, for 2 millennia the heartbeat of Egypt's soul, was looted and burned. The temples of Karnak and Luxor were stripped of their gold. The statues of Ammonius were dragged away. The sacred hymns that had once filled the night now gave way to silence. To the Assyrians it was victory, another empire subdued. To Egypt, it was a wound so deep that even the river seemed to mourn. The priests who survived fled south to Nubia. Others hid relics of the gods in secret chambers, burying memory itself in sand and stone. And yet, even in ruin, Egypt endured. When the Assyrians withdrew, they left behind chaos, but also the faint possibility of renewal. The delta cities, Sais, Tanis, Mendes, began to assert themselves under local rulers. One of these men, Samtik I, a governor under Assyrian watch, quietly gathered strength. Through diplomacy and patience, he unified the land once more, founding what would be known as the Sate dynasty, the last great native line of pharaohs. For a time, peace returned. Egypt traded with Greece, restored temples, and welcomed foreign scholars who came to learn from its ancient wisdom. The Assyrian storm, though devastating, had also cleared the old order, making way for a brief and brilliant final bloom. But something essential had changed. Egypt would never again stand alone as the unchallenged center of the world. The flow of power had shifted eastward and northward. The age of the Nile's dominion was ending. The age of empires beyond its desert horizons had begun. Still, in that twilight, the spirit of Egypt, serene, unbroken, lingered. The very stones of Thebes, scorched but standing, seemed to whisper a lesson older than kings. That power fades, but meaning endures. As the Assyrian banners vanished over the desert, the Nile returned to its rhythm. Fishermen cast their nets, farmers sowed their grain, and the sun rose over fields of green. Life, eternal and cyclical, continued as if empires were but passing storms. And beyond the Mediterranean, another world was awakening. One of marble, myth, and thought, where the name of Egypt would once more inspire wonder, as Greece began to dream of eternity. The sands of Egypt have always awaited conquerors, yet they never truly yield. When Alexander of Macedon crossed into Egypt in 332 BCE, he came not as a destroyer but as one seeking recognition. His conquests had already toppled the Persian Empire, and his legend had begun to ripple through the world. Yet as his armies approached the Nile Delta, something ancient stirred. Egypt had known many rulers, Libyan, Nubian, Assyrian, Persian, but none quite like this young king from the north, whose ambition seemed touched by myth. The Persians, who had long held Egypt under their rule, offered little resistance. The city of Memphis opened its gates. The people, weary of foreign governors who scorned their gods, greeted Alexander not as a conqueror but as a liberator. They saw in him a man favored by fortune, and perhaps by the divine. In their eyes, he was not merely king. He was the fulfillment of prophecy, the next vessel through whom Ma'at, the eternal order, might be restored. Alexander understood the power of symbols. He bowed before Egypt's traditions, not breaking them but embracing them. At Memphis, he was crowned as Pharaoh, son of Ra, a title spoken in the sacred tongue of the priests. The air must have shimmered with incense as his name was woven into hymns that had been sung for 2,000 years. To the Egyptians, this was continuity, another link in the endless chain of divine kingship. To Alexander, it was something else, the beginning of a legacy that would outlast his empire. Soon after, he turned westward, guided by a vision few could have imagined. Across the desert, beyond the shifting dunes, stood the remote oracle of Ammonius at Siwa Oasis, a sanctuary of the hidden god, whose word was sought only by the most daring souls. The journey was perilous. Men spoke of mirages and endless silence. Yet Alexander pressed on, believing the desert itself to be a test of destiny. When he finally reached Siwa, the priests received him in solemn reverence. No written record preserves their exact words, but tradition tells us that the oracle greeted him not as mortal king but as son of the god. What passed between Alexander and the oracle remains a mystery, a whisper carried by time. But when he emerged, his demeanor had changed. He no longer spoke of ruling the world merely as conqueror, but as a unifier, a bridge between east and west, mortal and divine. In the quiet solitude of that desert shrine, the Macedonian warrior seemed to have absorbed something of Egypt's timeless calm. On his return to the Nile, Alexander founded a city, Alexandria, at the mouth of the western delta. It would become one of the greatest cities of the ancient world, a meeting place of civilizations. He envisioned it as a beacon of learning and commerce, a port where Greek thought and Egyptian faith would intertwine. The streets were laid in a grid of marble and sand, its harbor open to the Mediterranean, drawing traders, scholars, and poets. In time, it would house the great library, the lighthouse of Pharaohs, and a blending of minds that would echo through centuries. For the Egyptians, Alexandria was both wonder and disruption. It was unlike anything they had ever seen, not a temple city built for gods, but a city of ideas open to the sea. Yet even here, the essence of Egypt endured. Temples rose beside Greek theaters. Statues of Isis stood beside those of Athena. Cultures mingled not in conflict, but in a quiet, graceful dance. Alexander's time in Egypt was brief, barely a year, yet its imprint was profound. He departed eastward to continue his conquests, leaving behind not ruins but renewal. The priests inscribed his name alongside those of Pharaohs past, and the people believed he had come not to erase, but to continue the eternal story. When news of his death reached Egypt years later, sorrow mingled with awe. His body, brought west from Babylon, was eventually laid to rest in Alexandria, the city of his dream. The desert, it seemed, had claimed another god. Through him, Egypt entered a new chapter, neither fully Egyptian nor wholly Greek, but something luminous in between. A civilization reborn as a dialogue between worlds. And from Alexander's brief dream, another dynasty began to rise. One that would blend the golden dust of Egypt with the marble light of Greece. Between two worlds, Egypt became a crossroads of memory. When Ptolemy I Soter, one of Alexander's trusted generals, claimed Egypt as his share of the fallen conqueror's empire, he inherited more than a province. He inherited a civilization that had already seen 3,000 years of dawns. The Nile still flowed in its ageless rhythm, the temples still gleamed beneath the desert sun, and the people still whispered prayers to gods whose names predated Greece itself. Yet Egypt was changing. The new rulers spoke Greek, not the language of the Pharaohs. Their lineage traced to Macedon, not Memphis. But Ptolemy, astute, pragmatic, and reverent, understood that Egypt could not be ruled by sword alone. It must be ruled by symbol. And so he took on the mantle of Pharaoh, not as a mere title but as a living bridge between cultures. In the temples of Philae, Edfu, and Dendra, priests inscribed hymns in hieroglyphs that praised the new ruler, as if he were a descendant of Ra. Yet, in the palaces of Alexandria, poets and scholars recited Homer and debated the cosmos. This duality, ancient faith and new thought, defined the Ptolemaic age. Egypt became a land of mirrors, where Greek intellect met Egyptian eternity. Ptolemy I's most enduring legacy was not conquest, but knowledge. Under his patronage, Alexandria became the intellectual heart of the Hellenistic world. Its library, later mythologized as the greatest in history, was said to hold hundreds of thousands of scrolls, the accumulated wisdom of Greece, Egypt, Babylon, and beyond. Scholars gathered from every corner of the known world. Mathematicians, philosophers, astronomers, poets. They came seeking truth, and in their pursuit, the boundaries between cultures blurred. Within those marble halls, Euclid wrote his Elements, distilling geometry into timeless clarity. Eratosthenes measured the circumference of the earth by watching shadows fall across the desert. Herophilus dissected the human body, mapping its mysteries with reverence rather than fear. And among them all, the spirit of Egypt, its quiet fascination with order, with harmony, lingered like an invisible guide. The city itself reflected this union. Alexandria, shimmering beside the sea, became a place where East and West met in balance. The lighthouse of Pharaohs, one of the seven wonders, stood as both beacon and symbol, a tower of light rising from the waves, guiding travelers home. It was as if Egypt had found a new expression of its ancient faith, illumination through knowledge. But beneath the surface calm, another story unfolded. The Ptolemaic court was a theater of ambition and intrigue. Successive rulers, each named Ptolemy, each married to a Cleopatra, Arsinoe, or Berenice, wove a complex tapestry of alliances and betrayals. Greek customs governed the palace, but Egyptian ritual sanctified the throne. The rulers were crowned in both languages, worshipped by two peoples who saw in them different reflections. To the Greeks, they were kings of empire. To the Egyptians, they were divine heirs of Horus. This delicate harmony could not endure forever. The Ptolemies, heirs to both Athens and Thebes, found themselves torn between two legacies. Some favored the cosmopolitan vision of Alexandria, Greek thought, Greek art, Greek politics. Others turned inward, embracing the ancient gods to secure the loyalty of Egypt's heartland. The dynasty, for all its brilliance, became consumed by its own contradictions. Even so, the arts and sciences flourished. Temples were rebuilt in pharaonic style, though their inscriptions now blended Greek and hieroglyphic text. The Temple of Edfu, dedicated to Horus, rose with the grandeur of the Old Kingdom. At Philae, the cult of Isis blossomed anew, her worship spreading beyond Egypt's borders into the Mediterranean world. The old religion found new breath, its myths retold in Greek tongues but carrying Egyptian soul. For centuries, this equilibrium persisted, fragile, luminous, and improbable. The Nile still nourished its people. The scholars still debated in marble courtyards. The ships still carried papyrus, spices, and grain to distant ports. Egypt, though ruled by foreigners, remained itself. The eternal pattern continued. Sowing, flooding, harvesting. The rhythm of Ma'at unbroken. Yet history moves not in circles, but in spirals. The outside world pressed closer. To the west, a new power was rising, the Roman Republic, whose legions and laws would soon stretch from Spain to Syria. To the east, kingdoms once friendly to Egypt turned wary, sensing weakness behind the Ptolemaic facade. Internal strife deepened. Brothers warred against brothers. Queens plotted against their kin. And through this lineage of rulers, one figure would rise above all: Cleopatra VII, the last of her house and the final pharaoh of Egypt. She was born into a court where intrigue was an inheritance and diplomacy an art. Educated in philosophy, languages, and astronomy, she spoke to her people in Egyptian, the first Ptolemy to do so in centuries. To the Greeks, she was a scholar. To the Egyptians, a goddess reborn. Cleopatra's reign was a fragile dance between worlds. Rome's shadow grew longer across the Mediterranean, and she understood that Egypt's survival depended on grace, not force. Her alliances with Julius Caesar and later Mark Antony were not merely affairs of love, but acts of strategy, efforts to preserve Egypt's sovereignty through diplomacy. Yet to the world beyond, these alliances became the stuff of legend, clouded by politics and passion. Under Cleopatra, Egypt saw a brief renaissance. Trade expanded, temples thrived, and the arts reached a final flowering. The image of Isis was everywhere. The divine mother, protector of kings, and Cleopatra herself embodied her mythic spirit. She sailed the Nile on gilded barges, her presence an act of ceremony, her words measured and deliberate. To her people, she was the living link between heaven and earth. But destiny, long patient, was closing in. Rome's ambitions could not be softened forever by charm or intellect. When Octavian, the future Augustus, marched against her and Antony, the struggle was not only for power, but for the soul of the ancient world. The final battle at Actium in 31 BCE ended not in glory, but in silence. Antony fell and Cleopatra followed, choosing death by her own hand rather than surrender. With her passing, the line of pharaohs, stretching back more than 3 millennia, came to an end. Egypt became a province of Rome, its temples now monuments of memory. The scholars of Alexandria still studied the heavens. The priests still tended the fires at Philae, but the voice of divine kingship was gone. And yet, the idea of Egypt, its calm grandeur, its harmony between spirit and stone, would never fade. In Greek and Roman art, in Hebrew scripture and later Christian thought, Egypt became a symbol of mystery, wisdom, and endurance. The civilization that had once risen from the Nile's mud had now entered the river of eternity. As the Mediterranean world shifted into a new age, Egypt remained its silent conscience. A land that had seen everything, remembered everything, and lost nothing that truly mattered. But power built on compromise rarely lasts. And soon, the world would look upon Egypt not as a kingdom of the living, but as a wonder of the past. In Cleopatra, the Nile dreamed one last dream of sovereignty. She was born into a world of shifting power, where Egypt's crown glittered more in memory than in might. The once mighty Ptolemaic dynasty had grown frail, a lineage tangled in rivalries and debts, its throne both gilded and fragile. Yet from this fading house arose a queen unlike any before her. Cleopatra VII Philopator, the last pharaoh of Egypt, and the last voice of an ancient world that still believed kings could be divine. From her youth, Cleopatra was different. Fluent in many tongues, Greek, Aramaic, Hebrew, Latin, and Egyptian, she was the first of her line to speak to her people in their own language. Her mind was steeped in philosophy and science, her wit as sharp as the reeds of the Nile. To her, Egypt was not a prize to be defended, but a spirit to be sustained. She saw in her ancestors' failures the slow unraveling of Ma'at, the sacred order that once bound God, ruler, and land. Her reign would seek to restore that harmony, not through armies, but through intellect and grace. When Julius Caesar entered Alexandria in pursuit of his rival Pompey, he found not merely a divided kingdom, but a queen in exile. Cleopatra returned to her capital with audacity and brilliance. Legend tells of her slipping into Caesar's chambers wrapped in a carpet. Yet behind this gesture of theater lay a precise calculation. Egypt's survival depended on Rome's favor. With Caesar's alliance, Cleopatra regained her throne, ruling beside her young brother as co-regent, but in truth as Egypt's sole mind and heart. For a brief moment, Egypt bloomed again. The Nile's temples were restored, trade with the East renewed, and scholars once more filled the libraries of Alexandria. Cleopatra's court became a place of learning and ceremony, where Greek reason and Egyptian ritual intertwined like the lotus and the papyrus. In her, Egypt's dual nature, mortal and divine, intellectual and mystical, found its final embodiment. But the tides of Rome were vast and unrelenting. After Caesar's death, Cleopatra turned to Mark Antony, another of Rome's titans, finding in him both an ally and a kindred soul. Their union, half political, half poetic, was more than romance. It was a last attempt to balance empires. Yet to Rome, it was an affront. The image of an Eastern queen enthralling one of their own became a symbol of corruption and threat. In 31 BCE, at Actium, their fleets met the legions of Octavian, Caesar's heir. The outcome was swift and final. Defeated, Antony and Cleopatra retreated to Alexandria, the city where their dreams had begun. As Roman troops approached, Cleopatra gathered her treasures, her dignity unbroken. She refused the humiliation of being paraded through Rome as a conquered monarch. Instead, she chose death, legend says by the bite of an asp, the sacred serpent of the Pharaohs, a final act of sovereignty in a world that had forgotten what that meant. When she died, the light of 3,000 years dimmed. The age of pharaohs, of living gods, of divine order written in stone and sand, ended with her final breath. Rome took Egypt, but it could never truly possess it. For Egypt had already entered eternity. And with her passing, Egypt whispered its farewell to time. The winds of the Mediterranean carried a new banner across the desert, the Eagle of Rome. When Octavian, soon to be known as Augustus, claimed victory at Actium in 31 BCE, Egypt's independence, long strained, long proud, came to a quiet end. The Nile, once the lifeline of a god-king's realm, now flowed within an empire ruled by mortals. Yet for all Rome's triumph, Egypt remained unlike any of its conquests. It was not merely another province. It was the jewel of the empire's crown, the breadbasket of the ancient world, the land that fed both Caesar and the legions. From the beginning, Augustus treated Egypt not as an equal, nor as a typical Roman province, but as something set apart, sacred and strategic. He forbade senators from entering it without his permission. Its governance was entrusted not to Roman nobles, but to equestrian prefects, administrators who owed loyalty directly to the emperor. To control Egypt was to control Rome's grain supply, and therefore the fate of the empire itself. The harvests of the Nile Delta, rich beyond comparison, sustained millions across the Mediterranean. Each year, fleets sailed from Alexandria, their holds heavy with grain, their sails catching the desert wind as if carrying the breath of Osiris himself. Yet while the eagle soared above, the lotus still bloomed below. The people of Egypt, farmers, scribes, and priests alike, adapted to their new rulers with quiet endurance. Life along the Nile continued in rhythms that predated Rome's founding. The temples of Philae, Dendra, and Edfu remained alive with incense and hymns, their columns painted with the stories of gods that Rome could never erase. The emperors, seeking favor and legitimacy, took on the titles of pharaoh when ruling from afar. In the sacred carvings of temple walls, Augustus and his successors were depicted offering gifts to the gods, much as Ramses or Thutmose once had. The imagery remained eternal, only the faces had changed. In Alexandria, the empire's influence was strongest. The city gleamed as a meeting of worlds, Greek, Egyptian, and Roman, its marble streets filled with merchants, scholars, and soldiers. The great lighthouse of Pharaohs still guided ships into its harbor, and the library, though diminished by fire and time, continued to draw minds from across the known world. Philosophers discussed Aristotle beneath Egyptian skies. Astronomers measured the stars reflected in the Nile's waters. Egypt had once exported grain and gold, now it also exported knowledge. Roman Egypt became a place of duality, of temples to Isis standing beside altars to Jupiter, of hieroglyphs inscribed beside Latin edicts. The two civilizations intertwined not through conquest alone, but through coexistence. The goddess Isis, once confined to Egypt, became a figure of devotion across the Roman world, her temples rising in Pompeii, Athens, and Rome itself. Through her, the ancient spiritual heart of Egypt pulsed far beyond its borders. The mysteries of the Nile had found new listeners. Yet beneath the surface, the old ways slowly faded. The priesthoods, once powerful stewards of land and knowledge, saw their influence wane as Roman administration spread. Taxes were collected not in offerings to gods, but in coin for Caesar. The hieroglyphic script, sacred and complex, gave way to Greek and Latin, languages of commerce and governance. Even so, some temples resisted, places like Philae, where the cult of Isis continued for centuries, maintaining rituals long after the emperors who tolerated them had turned to dust. Egypt's identity did not vanish. It transformed. The spiritual silence that once accompanied the pharaoh's divine rule was replaced by new voices, Roman poets, Greek philosophers, and Coptic monks who would soon weave a new faith along the Nile's banks. The temples might have grown quieter, but the sense of eternity remained. Every stone, every carving, seemed to whisper that no empire lasts forever, but all leave echoes. For Rome, Egypt became both pride and warning, proof of the grandeur it could command, and of the civilizations that had preceded it. To walk among the ruins of Thebes or gaze upon the pyramids was to confront the fragility of empire itself. Even Augustus, whose rule began this new age, recognized that his dominion rested on the same sands that had buried kings before him. And so, Egypt continued, not conquered, not extinguished, but absorbed into the flow of history, its spirit quietly reshaping those who claimed to rule it. The Roman eagle might have flown above its temples, but in the stillness of the desert nights, the gods of the Nile endured patient, ancient, unbroken. As the centuries turned, and the empire's borders shifted once more, Egypt remained what it had always been, a land where time itself seemed to breathe. And in the whisper of that eternal river, one could almost hear it say, "All empires pass. The Nile remains." As the eagle's shadow stretched across the sands, another faith, new and rising, prepared to take root where the old gods had once walked. In every chapel and marketplace, echoes of Ra mingled with the voice of Christ. As the centuries unfolded under Rome's quiet dominance, Egypt transformed, not through conquest or rebellion, but through the steady pulse of time. The empire's banners changed, its emperors rose and fell, yet the Nile continued its patient rhythm, nourishing fields that had seen the rise of both gods and men. In this enduring landscape, old beliefs softened, blending into new ones. The temples still stood, but within their shadows, a different faith began to stir. By the 1st century CE, Egypt was no longer the center of an empire but had become the crossroads of civilizations. Greeks, Romans, Jews, and Egyptians walked the same crowded streets, traded in the same markets, prayed under the same sky. Alexandria, still gleaming at the edge of the Mediterranean, became the cradle of new ideas. In its libraries and lecture halls, philosophers debated the nature of divinity, not in the form of Horus or Isis, but in the universal language of spirit and reason. It was here that Jewish scholars translated the Hebrew scriptures into Greek, forming the Septuagint, and where early Christian thinkers would later write words that echoed across centuries. The transition from polytheism to Christianity did not come as a sudden storm, but as a dawn, gradual, gentle, inevitable. The goddess Isis, so long the mother of magic and protector of the Nile, became strangely familiar to new believers who spoke of another mother, another child, another promise of eternal life. The old symbols found refuge in new meanings. The Ankh became the cross, the sacred water became baptism, and the tomb became the promise of resurrection. For many Egyptians, this change was not a rejection of the past, but a continuation of it. The divine order, Ma'at, had always spoken of balance, justice, and truth, ideals that found echoes in the teachings of Christ. The temples of Luxor, Philae, and Abydos still called worshippers, yet beside them rose small chapels where prayers were whispered in Greek and Coptic. The rhythm of faith shifted, but the melody of devotion remained unchanged. The Roman Empire itself began to waver, its borders pressed by new powers, its unity strained. Yet Egypt, as always, endured. Its grain still fed the empire. Its priests still studied the stars. Its scholars still sought meaning in words and numbers. And when Emperor Constantine embraced Christianity in the 4th century, Egypt's transformation entered a new age. The Council of Nicaea in 325 CE would draw heavily on Egyptian theologians, and soon after, Alexandria became one of the great centers of Christian thought. Figures such as Athanasius and Origen shaped doctrines that would define the faith for millennia. But this new dawn came with shadows. The temples of the old gods, once alive with incense and hymns, began to fall silent. One by one, the statues of Ammonius, Horus, and Hathor were veiled, their sanctuaries sealed. The great temple of Philae, devoted to Isis, stood as the final refuge of Egypt's ancient religion. Even as Christian monks founded their monasteries in the deserts, pilgrims continued to journey there, lighting lamps to the goddess who had watched over Egypt for 3,000 years. It was not until the 6th century under Emperor Justinian that the worship of the old gods was finally extinguished. The priests of Isis were dispersed, and the last hieroglyphic inscriptions, the last written prayers in the language of the Pharaohs, were carved at Philae around 394 CE. With them, an epoch quietly ended. Yet in truth, Egypt had not lost its spirit, it had merely transformed it. The rise of Coptic Christianity preserved the ancient language, reshaped into new sounds and letters. The desert monks of Cetus and Antinoe lived in quiet devotion, their days marked by prayer, their nights by the stars. The sands that had once hidden tombs now sheltered monasteries, and the same solitude that once spoke to Osiris now whispered to Christ. Alexandria, too, continued to shine as a beacon of learning. The catechetical school of Alexandria became a center of Christian philosophy, where faith and reason intertwined. The city's scholars studied not only the Bible but also the works of Plato and Aristotle, weaving together threads of Greek logic and Egyptian mysticism into something uniquely profound. Even as empires fractured and new kingdoms arose, Egypt's legacy of thought, its quiet pursuit of the eternal, endured. And though the statues of the old gods faded beneath desert dust, their essence survived in art, architecture, and memory. The domes of new churches echoed the curves of ancient temples. The painted icons of saints carried the same solemn grace as the carvings of Osiris and Isis. The Nile itself remained a sacred presence, its waters still rising and falling as they had since the dawn of civilization. Unchanging, eternal. By the time the Roman Empire's western half collapsed in the 5th century, Egypt had already entered a new era. Not of pharaohs or emperors, but of monks and scholars, of prayers sung in candlelight, of endurance through faith. The old world had not died. It had merely found another way to speak. And as the centuries turned, and the sands began to cover the stones of forgotten temples, Egypt remained what it had always been, a vessel of continuity. Empires could claim it, religions could reshape it, but the heart of the land, the pulse of the Nile, and the quiet wisdom of its people persisted. As the last rays of the Roman sun faded into history, Egypt stood in silence once more, sacred, enduring, waiting for yet another dawn. As centuries turned, the old gods slept, but the land remained sacred. Civilizations do not end. They dissolve, like silt carried away by the river they loved. After centuries under Roman rule, Egypt passed into the hands of Byzantium, the Eastern Empire that called itself Rome's true heir. The banners changed, the language of authority became Greek, but for the people along the Nile, little seemed altered. The taxes still came, the harvests still fed distant capitals, and the slow rhythm of the seasons still ruled life more than any emperor's decree. Yet beneath that quiet continuity, something subtle began to fade, a weariness, like the slow dimming of a once bright flame. The Byzantine centuries were years of endurance. Christianity had taken firm root, reshaping Egypt's identity, yet it also brought division. The people's faith, once united beneath the temples of Isis or Ammonius, now split along lines of doctrine. The Coptic Church, proud and deeply rooted in local tradition, stood apart from the imperial orthodoxy of Constantinople. The disputes over the nature of Christ, whether human, divine, or both, were not mere abstractions. They became questions of belonging, of who spoke for Egypt's soul. And as the imperial soldiers enforced distant decrees, resentment grew, quiet but unyielding. The once great cities, Alexandria foremost among them, suffered from time and conflict. The great lighthouse of Pharaohs, once a wonder of the world, was shaken by earthquakes, its beacon dimming into ruin. The Library of Alexandria, long a symbol of learning, had already faded into legend. Its scrolls lost, its memory surviving only in whispers. The scholars who had once debated the cosmos were gone, replaced by priests, monks, and traders. The center of Egyptian life had shifted inward, from the bustling harbors to the cloisters of monasteries scattered across the desert. It was in these silent places, far from politics and war, that Egypt's enduring spirit sought refuge. The desert fathers and mothers of Coptic monasticism carried on the tradition of reflection and balance that had once defined Ma'at. Their prayers rose not to the sun god but to the unseen divine. Yet their solitude echoed that of ancient priests who once waited for dawn within temple walls. The stones might have changed, but the silence remained the same. The Byzantine grip on Egypt weakened with each generation. Droughts, taxation, and unrest eroded its prosperity. Trade routes shifted, and foreign merchants came to dominate its harbors. By the early 7th century, Egypt was weary, spiritually and materially exhausted, yet still unbroken. When Arab armies crossed the Sinai in 639 CE, they met not a nation prepared for war, but a land ready for another transformation. And so the old order passed quietly, almost peacefully. The Byzantines departed, and new rulers took their place. Yet Egypt, as always, remained itself, patient, timeless, eternal beneath the changing skies. As the Byzantine banners faded into dust and the first calls to prayer echoed along the Nile, history turned another page. And still, beneath the sands, Egypt's story waited to be rediscovered. When the past spoke again, it did so through fragments of forgotten tongues. For centuries, Egypt had slept beneath its own silence, its temples half buried in sand, its gods forgotten by name, its monuments weathered into mystery. Travelers from Greece and Rome had once written of its marvels, but by the Middle Ages even memory had turned to myth. The pyramids were whispered to be the work of giants. The hieroglyphs, a sacred language lost to human understanding. Yet time, which had buried Egypt, would also awaken it. In 1798, Napoleon Bonaparte sailed across the Mediterranean not only with soldiers, but with scholars, engineers, and artists, men who carried notebooks and ink instead of swords. They came not just to conquer, but to study, to measure, to record. When they reached the banks of the Nile, they were struck by what they saw. A civilization so ancient that even the stones seemed to hum with forgotten knowledge. Among the palm groves and ruins, these scholars began to work. They copied inscriptions, mapped temples, and filled volumes with sketches of statues and tombs. Their mission was not mere curiosity. It was the first great act of modern rediscovery. From their work came the monumental Description de l'Egypte, a vast compendium of Egyptian art, architecture, flora, and history, a mirror held up to the ancient world. Through its pages, Europe first glimpsed Egypt not as legend, but as truth. Then, in 1799, near the town of Rosetta, a French officer uncovered a slab of black basalt that would change history, the Rosetta Stone. It bore 3 scripts: Greek, Demotic, and hieroglyphic. The Greek text was readable, the others were not. Yet on that polished surface lay the key to a language locked for nearly 1,500 years. For scholars, it was as if the gods themselves had left a message in the dust, waiting for someone to listen. 2 decades later, a quiet revolution of intellect unfolded. In 1822, Jean-François Champollion, a young French linguist, announced that he had cracked the code of hieroglyphs. He realized that the symbols were not mystical emblems, but a mixture of phonetic sounds and sacred imagery, a bridge between sound and spirit. His cry, "Je tiens l'affaire, I've got it," echoed across Europe. For the first time in centuries, the words of the pharaohs could be read once more. The silence of the tombs had been broken. The rediscovery of Egypt became a kind of awakening for the world. Artists, poets, and explorers were drawn to it as if by magnetic force. The Romantic era saw in Egypt the reflection of timeless grandeur, a civilization that seemed to stand outside of mortality itself. Writers described it as the eternal mother of knowledge. Painters filled their canvases with pyramids glowing beneath desert suns. Travelers, from Giovanni Belzoni to Amelia Edwards, set out to uncover its hidden chambers. The age of Egyptology had begun. In Luxor, Karnak, and Abu Simbel, the sands were peeled away like layers of sleep. The faces of forgotten kings emerged once more into daylight. Ramses II, his jaw carved in stone. Hatshepsut, serene and resolute. Akhenaten, with eyes fixed on a distant truth. Each temple uncovered, each cartouche deciphered, became a thread rejoined to the fabric of human history. What had once seemed myth was revealed as memory. Yet this rediscovery was more than an act of science, it was an act of reverence. In the quiet of excavation sites, amid dust and heat, men and women stood before walls inscribed thousands of years before their birth, reading prayers that spoke of eternity and renewal. The pharaohs had built their monuments to outlast death, and through the scholars who uncovered them, they had succeeded. As the 19th century progressed, the fascination deepened. Museums across Europe and beyond began to fill with Egyptian artifacts. Statues, papyri, sarcophagi, each fragment a whisper from another world. In London, Paris, and Berlin, the relics of Egypt became objects of both study and wonder. They spoke of mathematics and art, of faith and kingship, of humanity's earliest search for meaning. But even amid this rush of discovery, there was reflection. A realization that Egypt's story was not only about the past, but about continuity. The same Nile that mirrored the temples of Ramses now reflected the sails of modern ships. The same stars that guided the builders of pyramids still glimmered above the archaeologists' camps. And through all the centuries of silence and rediscovery, Egypt had remained itself, patient, enduring, eternal. To walk among the ruins was to feel time bend. The hieroglyphs, once mute, now spoke again, not only of gods and kings, but of artisans, farmers, and dreamers. They told of the flood and the harvest, of joy and devotion, of a people who had sought harmony in a world of change. In every line and curve of their writing, there was calm precision, a mirror of the river that had shaped their lives. By the dawn of the modern era, Egypt had become a teacher once more. Its stones reminded humanity of continuity, that knowledge may fade, but never dies, that silence is not the end, but a waiting form of speech. Each discovery became a bridge, connecting our modern minds to ancient dreams. And through those dreams, the Nile began to flow again, not only through Egypt, but through the imagination of the world. In the quiet of museums, the ancient spirit still breathes. Walk through any great city, London, Paris, New York, Cairo, and the presence of Egypt lingers. It stands not only in statues and stones, but in the very shape of human imagination. Obelisks pierce modern skies. Columns carved in imitation of papyrus and lotus still hold the ceilings of courthouses and libraries. The dream of eternity that once rose beside the Nile has never ceased its ascent. The Egyptians believed that beauty could defy time. Their architecture, their art, and even their writing were acts of defiance against impermanence, symbols shaped to endure beyond flesh. To carve a name in stone was not vanity but salvation, for to be remembered was to live. And so, in every wall of hieroglyphs, in every statue polished to reflect the desert sun, the Egyptians inscribed their faith in continuity. That belief, that what is built with care and meaning can outlast its maker, remains one of humanity's most enduring legacies. Modern civilization has drawn deeply from this well of thought. The Greeks borrowed Egypt's architectural balance and its reverence for proportion. The Romans carried Egyptian obelisks to their capital, raising them in forums and temples as trophies of conquest and symbols of eternity. Centuries later, the builders of Renaissance Europe rediscovered those forms, translating their geometry into cathedrals and courtyards, into arches that rose like prayers in stone. Even the clean lines of modern architecture, the solemn strength of granite, the symmetry of facades, echo faintly with the calm authority of Egyptian design. But beyond structure and art, Egypt's truest inheritance is philosophical. The idea that life and death are not opposites but parts of one eternal cycle shaped its entire worldview. Every sunrise was a resurrection, every flood, a renewal. This belief, born beside the river, has rippled through faiths and philosophies for millennia. It appears in the words of Plato and the scriptures of mystics, in poetry and in science, the conviction that nothing is lost, only transformed. In this way, Egypt's culture was not merely ancient, it was timeless. Its thinkers pondered cosmic order long before telescopes or equations. The concept of Ma'at, that delicate balance between truth, harmony, and justice, anticipated ideas that modern society still strives to define. In law, in ethics, and even in art, the Egyptian principle endures, that creation must serve order, that beauty must reflect truth. Museums today are Egypt's second landscape. Within the still air of their halls, under soft white lights, the artifacts seem not dead, but resting. The sarcophagus of a queen, the papyrus of a scribe, the mask of a god, all retain a quiet vitality. To look upon them is to stand at the meeting point of worlds. For a moment, the boundaries between then and now dissolve. The ancient calm of Egypt reaches forward through time, touching the minds of those who pause to listen. Even language carries echoes of its wisdom. Words like horizon, alchemy, and pharaoh have traveled unchanged across centuries. The symbol of the Ankh, once the sign of life, adorns jewelry and art today, its meaning undiminished. In literature, Egypt stands as a metaphor for permanence, for the endurance of spirit beyond decay. Poets still write of its sands and pyramids as though speaking to eternity itself. The fascination is not nostalgia. It is recognition. Humanity sees in Egypt something of its own longing, the wish to be remembered, to find meaning in the face of impermanence. The pyramids, rising against the desert's endless horizon, remind us that time is both destroyer and preserver. They stand not because they resist time, but because they have become part of it. In art, Egypt continues to inspire the language of form. Painters of the 19th century, architects of the Art Deco era, and filmmakers of the modern age all return to its visual grammar, the balance between symmetry and mystery, the grace of stillness. The human figure, painted in profile but shown in full presence, remains one of the most iconic expressions of how the Egyptians saw existence. Not from a single viewpoint, but as the sum of all perspectives. And in the rhythm of modern spiritual life, Egypt's influence flows quietly beneath the surface. The mysticism of the Nile found echoes in Hermetic philosophy, in alchemy, and in the esoteric traditions of both East and West. To the Egyptians, knowledge itself was sacred, a form of communion with the divine. That same reverence for learning underlies universities, libraries, and the pursuit of understanding across centuries. To study the world, they believed, was to honor creation. Through every age, Egypt has reminded us that civilization is not a line but a circle, a pattern of rise, decay, and renewal. Its monuments endure because they were built not only of stone but of intention. They carry within them the silence of those who shaped them and the vision of those who dreamed beyond their own lifetimes. In their shadow, we feel both humility and wonder, humility for our transience, wonder for our capacity to create what endures. Even now, as archaeologists continue to unearth tombs, as satellites map forgotten ruins beneath the sand, Egypt is still giving. Each discovery adds a verse to the oldest story humanity knows, the story of itself. The past, once lost, becomes part of our present understanding. And so, when we look upon the calm face of a pharaoh or trace the curve of a hieroglyph, we are not simply observing history, we are conversing with it. In that conversation, we find something gently reassuring. That time does not erase meaning, it deepens it. The desert wind still whispers across the stones. The Nile still carries reflections of temples and stars. The spirit of Egypt endures, not confined to its borders, but alive wherever humans remember, create, and seek balance. And so the river continues, unbroken, eternal. Empires rise and fall, but the river flows, as it always has, as it always will. The story of Egypt is not only the story of kings and monuments, but of the quiet endurance of life itself. Beneath the golden dust and between the long shadows of stone, the Nile has never ceased its patient rhythm. Civilizations have been born along its banks, languages have faded into silence, faiths have risen like the morning sun and set like the evening sky, yet the river continues unhurried, unchanging. It begins far beyond the deserts, among rains and highlands unseen by pharaohs, gathering itself into a single silver thread that winds northward through the land of eternity. Every drop that touches its waters carries with it the memory of countless generations, of hands that built and sewed, of voices that prayed and dreamed. The Nile has been the witness of all things, of triumph and collapse, of devotion and discovery, of the first plow and the last echo of forgotten hymns. When we look upon its calm surface today, we are not merely gazing at a river. We are looking into time itself, into the quiet movement of continuity. The pyramids may seem eternal, yet even they were shaped by this same current, this same principle of renewal. Egypt has endured not through conquest, but through rhythm. Its heart beats not in its temples or its tombs, but in the endless flow of the river that binds past to present, life to memory. In the stillness of evening, as the sun sinks beyond the palms and the horizon glows with amber light, one can almost sense the voices of history moving through the wind. The laughter of builders at Giza, the chants of priests at Karnak, the soft recitations of monks in desert caves, all carried onward, woven into the same eternal song. Every civilization, like every wave, rises, breaks, and returns to the source. Egypt understood this better than any other. The pharaohs sought immortality in stone, yet their true immortality lies elsewhere. In the enduring peace of a civilization that taught the world to see time not as an enemy, but as a companion. In the Nile's flow, they found a reflection of eternity, always changing, yet always the same. And so, as the centuries fade into one another, the story continues. The stars that shone above Thebes still shine tonight. The sands that once covered tombs still drift softly in the desert wind. And the river, the quiet, ceaseless river, still carries Egypt's soul to the sea. History, like water, finds its way home. The river flows, and Egypt endures.